Before you drift into the story of Josephine Esther Menser, the girl from Corona, Queens, who became Estée Lauder, it helps to understand why her life still whispers through department stores, boardrooms, and the quiet calculus of ambition. She did not invent beauty. She invented the idea that beauty could be sold through touch, through obligation, through the alchemy of a free sample and a promise. She turned a chemist uncle's creams into a $5 billion empire, not by accident, but by relentless, calculated presence. She understood that a counter was a stage, a demonstration, a seduction, and that control over product, message, and myth was the only currency that mattered. In doing so, she reshaped an industry, built a dynasty, and left a template that still governs how luxury is bought and sold. Yet her story is not without shadow. She erased her immigrant roots, fabricated a Viennese past, and built her brand on exclusion, slow to integrate her counters, dismissive of voices that did not flatter her vision. She worked her family without mercy, blurred the line between motherhood and management, and left behind questions about what was owed, what was stolen, and what was simply survived. Her philanthropy was real, but it was also strategic. Her generosity was measured. Her myth was curated with the same precision she applied to a jar of cream. This is not a tale of sudden fortune or singular genius. It is the long, deliberate arc of a woman who learned early that the world would not give her anything, and so she took, politely, persistently, and without apology. What follows is the story of that taking: the uncle's lab, the socks ambush, the youth do revolution, the public offering that made her billions while keeping her control. It is a story of beauty and cunning, of empire and cost, told gently, so you may consider what remains when the lights dim and the counters close. Welcome to Richie Rich Stories. Please do not forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, share the video with your circle, and let us know where you are from, what time it is now, and how you feel today in the comments below. Now, pick your sweetest spot and enjoy tonight's story. This audiobook is based on true stories, but some events, characters, places, and conversations are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The gaslights flickered across Corona, Queens, as dusk settled over the narrow streets in the autumn of 1923. The air carried the mingled sense of coal smoke from the tenements, yeast from the bakeries, and the sharp tang of metal shavings from Max Menser's hardware store. Above the shop, 15-year-old Josephine Esther Menser Estée to her family stood before the clouded mirror in the cramped bathroom she shared with 8 siblings, dabbing a pearlescent cream beneath her eyes. Carefully, she whispered to herself in the half-light, "Like Uncle John showed you." The cream felt cool against her skin, smoothing into an invisible veil. Not like the gritty, waxy concoctions the Italian girls bought from the pharmacy on Northern Boulevard. This was different. This was science. 3 months earlier, her uncle Dr. John Schatz had invited her into what he grandly called his laboratory, a converted stable behind his house, where the pungent scents of lanolin and rosewater replaced the long-vanished smell of horses. There, among glass beakers and tins of beeswax, the Hungarian chemist had initiated his niece into ancient mysteries of emulsion. "You see, Estée," he had explained, measuring oils with meticulous precision, "beauty is not frivolity, it is chemistry. The perfect balance of elements." His accent thickened around certain words, a reminder of the world left behind, the Europe that still burned in their blood. She had watched, transfixed as he combined ingredients in precise proportions: lanolin, mineral oil, waxes, delicate fragrances. The super-rich all-purpose cream was born before her eyes, a miracle of science housed in simple jars. Now, in the dim bathroom light, she studied her reflection. Tomorrow was market day, and she had 5 jars carefully wrapped in tissue paper, nestled in a basket. Mrs. Finkelstein from 2 doors down had already promised to buy one. So had the seamstress on the corner, and 3 girls from school. 50 cents each. $2.50. Enough to buy better jars next time, maybe even printed labels. "Estée, are you in there all night?" Her mother's voice, tired after a day of minding the younger children and helping in the hardware store, carried through the door. "Coming, Mama," she answered, but lingered a moment longer. Estée. The name had begun as a playful variation among her school friends, a sophisticated French twist on her middle name, Estée. It felt like silk on the tongue, like something that belonged on a glass bottle, something a fine lady might buy. Morning brought the cacophony of Queens to life. Streetcars rattled down Northern Boulevard, peddlers shouted their wares, and radios crackled with news of President Coolidge's latest speech. The hardware store below opened early, the bell on the door chiming as Max Mincer welcomed his first customers. Upstairs, Rose Mincer stood at the stove, her hands red from hot water, deftly flipping blintzes for the younger children. "Estée, take some bread for lunch," she called without turning. "And be home before dark." Estée slipped the wrapped jars into her basket, covering them with a checkered cloth. "I have appointments after school, Mama." The word appointments felt important in her mouth. "Professional. For my creams." Rose turned then, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face carried the weathered beauty of a woman who had survived childbirth 9 times, who had crossed oceans, who understood hardship. She reached out to touch her daughter's face. "Such ideas in that head. Always dreaming, my Estée." A sigh, not unkind. "Be careful with dreams. They don't always feed a family." "These will," Estée replied with quiet certainty. "You'll see." Outside, Corona pulsed with immigrant energy. Yiddish mingled with Italian on the street corners. Men in caps hurried to factories and shops. Women bargained fiercely at vegetable carts. This was the New York of strivers, of people who had left everything behind to build something from nothing. Estée walked with purpose, her basket secure in the crook of her arm. School was a necessary diversion from her real work. At 15, she already understood something vital. Knowledge came in many forms, and not all of it lived in textbooks. Miss Greenberg's mathematics class droned on, chalk dust dancing in shafts of autumn sunlight. Estée's pencil moved across her notebook, but she wasn't calculating fractions. She was designing labels, sketching elegant script for her super-rich all-purpose cream. "Miss Mincer." The teacher's voice sliced through her reverie. "Perhaps you'd care to share your calculations with the class." Heat rose in Estée's cheeks as she looked down at her notebook, filled not with numbers but with flowing designs. Before she could respond, the bell rang. Saved by mathematics itself, by the predictable progression of time. In the hallway afterward, Estée found herself beside Ruth Levinson, a girl from a wealthy family who wore silk stockings and had a father in the garment business. "I saw your drawings," Ruth said, curiosity brightening her eyes. Are you making something? Estée hesitated only briefly. This was opportunity knocking, not making created. A special cream my uncle and I formulated. It smooths the skin better than anything from the department stores. Really? Ruth's skepticism was evident. I'll prove it. Estée reached into her basket and withdrew a jar. May I? Without waiting for permission, she took Ruth's hand and applied a dab of cream, spreading it with practiced fingers. Feel how it absorbs. Not greasy like Pond's. This is what the fine European ladies use. It wasn't entirely true. This was her uncle's formula, made in a converted stable in Queens, but the essence was honest. The cream was superior. And sometimes, Estée was learning, you had to clothe truth in dreams to make people see it. Ruth's eyes widened as she felt her skin. It does feel different. Of course it does. Estée's voice carried absolute conviction. $2 for the jar. $2? Ruth blinked. The Pond's cream is only 50 cents at Woolworth's. Estée met her gaze steadily. This isn't Pond's. This is something special, something just for you. The just for you was instinctive, a truth she had discovered in her first sales. Everyone wanted to feel singular, chosen. Ruth hesitated, then reached into her purse and withdrew the money. It better be worth it, she said, but her fingers already returned to touch her skin where the cream had been applied. Come to my house tomorrow after school, Estée said, pocketing the bills. I'll show you how to apply it properly. Bring your friends. That evening, in the kitchen above the hardware store, Estée sat at the table counting coins. $2 from Ruth, 50 cents each from Mrs. Finkelstein and the seamstress. Another $1 from the butcher's wife. $4 in total, almost enough for the new jars she'd seen in a supplier's catalog. Glass with gold-tone lids. Her father entered, smelling of metal and machine oil. Max Mentzer's shoulders stooped from years of lifting inventory, his hands calloused from work. He nodded at his youngest daughter's collection of coins. "Business is good?" he asked in Yiddish. "Yes, Papa," she answered in English. She always spoke English at home, pushing back against the old world, embracing the new. Max switched to heavily accented English. "What will you do with this money? New dress? Shoes?" "New jars," Estée replied. "Better packaging. Then I can charge more." Her father's laugh was not mocking, but puzzled. More for the same cream? Who will pay? People who want to feel special, Papa. People who believe they deserve beautiful things. Max studied his daughter, seeing something in her that reminded him not of himself or Rose, but of his own father, a merchant in the old country with an uncanny sense for what people would pay for and why. "You know," he said slowly, "in Hungary, my father always said, the jar sells the pickles, but you must have good pickles first, yes?" Estée smiled. "Uncle John's formula is the best. The jar just helps people see it." Max nodded, a flicker of pride crossing his weathered face. "Be careful with the rich ladies. They can be cruel to girls like us." "I'm not afraid of them," Estée said, and she meant it. In her mind, there was no us and them, only those who recognized quality and those who hadn't been shown properly. Saturday morning found Estée in the converted stable behind her uncle's house. Dr. John Schatz, white-haired and precise, measured ingredients while his niece stirred the mixture in a large glass bowl. "You sold all 5 jars?" he asked, impressed despite himself. "At $2 each for 4 of them. The first was 50 cents to Mrs. Finkelstein." Estée kept her rhythm steady, watching the cream thicken. "And why the difference?" Her uncle measured 3 drops of rose oil into the mixture. Mrs. Finkelstein wouldn't pay more, but she'll tell her friends how good it is. The others, Estée paused. The others believe value comes with price. Dr. Schatz nodded approvingly. You understand people, more than chemistry. They worked in comfortable silence, the morning light filtering through dusty windows. This converted stable was a world apart from the bustle of Corona, a sanctuary of science and transformation. Uncle, Estée ventured after a while, could we make something with color, for lips or cheeks? Her uncle considered this, stroking his beard. Possible, but more complex, more ingredients. FDA is beginning to look at cosmetic regulations, you know. Not strict yet, but coming. But we could do it. We could try. He smiled at her eagerness. First, master this formula. Learn the basics before composing symphonies. Estée nodded, absorbing the lesson. Patience was difficult for her fiery nature, but she understood its value. Her uncle had not built his knowledge overnight. There's another thing, she said carefully. I need to touch people to sell the cream, show them how it feels. But some ladies don't like to be touched by, she hesitated. By a Jewish girl from Corona. Her uncle finished gently. Yes. Dr. Schatz sighed. America is better than Europe, but people are people everywhere. Remember this. When you touch someone's skin with kindness and healing, you speak a language older than prejudice. Your hands carry knowledge. Never be ashamed. Estée absorbed his words, storing them alongside formulas and business calculations. This, too, was education, how to maintain dignity in a world determined to withhold it. The following Wednesday, Estée found herself in an unfamiliar neighborhood. Ruth Levinson had invited her to a gathering at her home in Forest Hills, a newer, wealthier enclave where the houses stood apart from each other and had actual lawns. Ruth's mother's bridge club was meeting, and Ruth had suggested Estée bring her creams. They all spend fortunes on their faces, she had whispered in the school hallway. Show them what you showed me. Now, standing before the Levinsons' brick Tudor house with its leaded glass windows, Estée felt a momentary flutter of doubt. Her coat was 3 years old, mended carefully by her mother. Her shoes, while polished to a shine, were clearly worn. Would they see only a poor girl from Corona? She squared her shoulders and approached the door, basket in hand. Inside her basket were 10 jars, newly purchased, with cream she and her uncle had made just days before. The labels, handwritten in her finest script, read Estée Super Rich All-Purpose Cream. The maid who answered the door looked dubious, but directed her to the sunroom at the back of the house. There, around tables covered with crisp linen, sat 6 women in afternoon dresses, cards in hand, cigarettes sending lazy spirals of smoke toward the ceiling. Ah, Ruth's little friend with the magic cream. Mrs. Levinson's voice carried across the room, neither welcoming nor dismissive. Ladies, this is, what was your name, dear? Estée, she replied, dropping the Josephine entirely. In this moment, she wasn't the daughter of Max Menser, hardware store owner. She was Estée, creator of beauty. Estée has a marvelous cream, Ruth explained to the table. Show them, Estée. Setting her basket on a side table, Estée removed a jar and approached the first woman, a blonde with carefully plucked eyebrows and a strand of pearls that caught the light. May I? Estée asked, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. The woman glanced at Mrs. Levinson, who nodded almost imperceptibly. I suppose, the blonde said, extending her hand with reluctance. Estée opened the jar. The scent of roses filled the air, subtle, expensive. She took the woman's hand in hers, noting the manicured nails, the diamond ring. With gentle pressure, she massaged a small amount of cream into the skin. "Feel how it absorbs," she said softly. "No greasiness. Your skin drinks it in because it recognizes what it needs." The other women watched, cards temporarily forgotten. The blonde woman's eyebrows rose slightly as she felt her skin. "It is rather nice," she admitted. "Let me see." Another woman extended her hand, and Estée moved to her, repeating the process. "Where did you learn this?" the woman asked as Estée worked the cream into her skin. "My uncle is a dermatological chemist from Europe," Estée replied. It wasn't quite true. Dr. Schatz was a chemist, but not specifically dermatological. Yet the elevation seemed necessary here, in this room of pearls and privilege. One by one, she touched each woman's hand, letting them feel the difference. She spoke of ingredients from France, of scientific formulation, of the exclusive nature of her small batch process. The words flowed easily, a mixture of truth and aspiration. "How much?" asked Mrs. Levinson finally. $5 per jar," Estée answered without hesitation. A murmur rippled through the room. $5 was considerable, more than a good meal, almost a day's wages for many. "That's more than Pond's or Nivea," objected the blonde. "Of course it is," Estée replied with quiet confidence. "This isn't mass-produced. This is created specifically for women who understand quality." The implicit flattery was not lost on her audience. 4 women reached for purses. Bills were exchanged for jars. $20 more money than Estée had ever held at once. As she left the Levinson house an hour later, Estée felt a curious mixture of triumph and determination. She had sold 4 jars at $5 each. 6 remained in her basket. But more importantly, she had glimpsed another world, one of leisure and luxury, of women who purchased beauty without counting pennies. It was a world she intended to enter, not as a visitor, but as a merchant of dreams. December 1925 brought bitter cold to New York, and Christmas lights twinkled in shop windows along Northern Boulevard. Inside the Menser apartment, the family gathered around the table for Shabbat dinner, though business concerns often trumped strict religious observance in their household. "Estée has news," Rose announced as she served the brisket. "Tell them, Estée." All eyes turned to the 17-year-old, who sat straighter in her chair. In the past 2 years, she had sold hundreds of jars of cream, expanding to 3 formulations: the original all-purpose cream, a cleansing oil, and a light day cream. Her basket had been replaced by a leather case. Her customer base had grown from neighbors to ladies in Forest Hills, Kew Gardens, and even a few in Manhattan. "I've been invited to demonstrate my creams at the Wellesley House Salon in Manhattan," she announced. "Every Friday afternoon. They're giving me a counter near the front." Her siblings exchanged glances. Max put down his fork. Manhattan? Alone? His concern was evident. Who arranged this? "Mrs. Amory, the one who bought 6 jars last month. Her husband owns Wellesley House." Estée's voice remained steady. "I'll take the streetcar. It's perfectly safe." "A proper business," her oldest brother Samuel mused. "Will they pay you a salary?" "No," Estée replied. "I sell my creams, keep the money, minus 20% for the salon." She had negotiated this herself, instinctively understanding the value of her presence. how her demonstrations would bring curious women into the establishment. Rose wiped her hands on her apron, eyes bright with unshed tears. "My Esty," she said softly, "a businesswoman." Max studied his youngest daughter. The girl who had once played with dolls now discussed percentages and spoke of Manhattan with casual familiarity. There was pride in his gaze, but also something else, a recognition that she was moving into a world beyond Corona, beyond the hardware store, beyond their immigrant origins. "You'll need proper clothes," he said finally. "Samuel, take your sister to Bloomingdale's tomorrow. My account." Estée blinked in surprise. Her father was careful with money, especially as the business had struggled in recent years. "Thank you, Papa," she managed. Max nodded once. "When you stand at this counter in Manhattan, you represent not just yourself. You represent the Menser name. You will look the part." Later that night, after the others had gone to bed, Estée sat at the kitchen table with her ledger. Columns of careful figures tracked every penny spent on ingredients, jars, labels, and transportation. Another column showed sales, a steadily increasing line of numbers that proved what she had always believed. Women would pay for quality, for attention, for the promise of beauty. She ran her fingers over the name embossed on her newest jars. Estée, Fine Cosmetic Preparations, not Menser. Just Estée. The name felt right simple, elegant, memorable. A name that could be whispered between women sharing secrets. A name that could appear in cursive on glass bottles in fine department stores. Outside, snow began to fall on Corona, dusting the streets of her childhood with white. But Estée's thoughts were elsewhere, across the East River, where bigger dreams awaited. The jars of cream lined up before her were more than mixtures of oil and wax and fragrance. They were tickets to another life, one she could already see with perfect clarity. Touch your customer, and you're halfway there. The words had come to her naturally, an instinct born of hundreds of demonstrations. The other half was in the promise, the story, the transformation. And Estée Lauder, as she was increasingly thinking of herself, was just beginning to tell her story to the world. The last light of day faded over the brick apartments of Elmhurst as Estée pinned her graduation cap in place. June 1926, Newton High School. Not the beginning she had imagined, but not the end either. The mirror reflected back a young woman with determined eyes and a freshly applied coat of lipstick. Maybelline, drugstore quality, nothing like what she would one day create. "You're not going to college?" her classmate Ruth asked, adjusting her own cap. "What will you do?" Estée smiled, the kind of smile that revealed nothing while suggesting everything. "I'll find my way." College was for other girls, girls whose fathers weren't immigrant hardware store owners. Girls who had excelled at something other than watching customers, observing how they moved, what made them pause before a purchase. Her teachers had called her an indifferent student. They weren't wrong. The classroom had never captivated her like the theater of commerce. The Queens neighborhood outside hummed with the energy of a Saturday evening, Model Ts puttering down streets, young men in pressed suits heading toward illicit speakeasies where jazz would play until dawn. The Depression was still years away. Wall Street roared with possibility, and even in the outer boroughs, people dressed for the future they believed was coming. "I already have my education," Estée said, more to herself than to Ruth. That education had begun in her uncle's laboratory. John Schatz, chemist, dreamer, creator of skin creams that promised impossible things. She had watched him blend oils and waxes, had memorized his formulas while pretending merely to assist. Knowledge was valuable, but only if you knew how to sell it. By 1929, while others watched their fortunes collapse with the stock market, Estée was refining a different kind of currency: persuasion. The secret, she told herself as she prepared for another bridge party in a modest Long Island home, is not just to sell. It's to tell, then sell, then tell again. She arranged her jars of cream carefully in her case. New Egyptian formula, she called it, though Egypt had nothing to do with it. The name evoked something ancient and mysterious, something that might restore what time and worry were beginning to etch onto the faces of Queen's housewives. The bridge parties were her laboratory now. 4 tables, 16 women, all watching each other as much as their cards. She would arrive not as a salesperson, but as a beauty consultant, moving from table to table between hands, touching shoulders lightly, leaning in to whisper. "Your skin has such lovely undertones," she would say. Her voice pitched low as if sharing a precious secret. "May I?" And before the woman could refuse, Estée's fingers would be applying cream to her hand, her wrist, sometimes boldly to her face if the moment felt right. By the time the bridge game ended, she had usually sold 4 or 5 jars, not from pressure, but from performance, the ritual of application, the moment of attention, the promise of transformation. "You're quite good at this," said Mrs. Horowitz, host of that evening's game, as Estée counted her earnings. "Have you considered selling to department stores?" "Department stores sell to customers," Estée replied, tucking bills into her purse. "I prefer to sell to people." The distinction was everything. Joseph Lauder first saw her at Manhattan Beach in the summer of 1930. She wasn't swimming, but observing, studying the wealthy women who lounged under striped umbrellas. Their skin oiled against the sun, their conversations punctuated by laughter that suggested both ease and exclusion. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked, this serious man with accountant's eyes that seemed to calculate everything. "I'm working," she said. His smile revealed skepticism. "On the beach?" "Especially on the beach." She gestured toward the cabanas where women disappeared to change, to rest, to transform themselves between public appearances. "That's where you see what they really want, when they think no one's watching." Joseph was intrigued by this woman who spoke of beauty like a sociologist might discuss migration patterns. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, but he possessed something she recognized immediately: stability. In a world where the economy had begun its terrible slide, where bread lines stretched around city blocks and men sold apples on street corners, stability was its own kind of currency. They married later that year. A practical union, though not without affection. Joseph understood numbers, the clean rationality of balance sheets, the poetry of well-kept books. Estée understood people, their vanities, their insecurities, the secret hopes that made them reach for a jar of cream, as if it contained not just lanolin and beeswax, but possibility itself. "We'll do well together," she told him on their wedding night, speaking not just of their marriage, but of what they might build. He nodded, already calculating how her informal business might become something more structured. "I can help with the accounting, the inventory management," he offered. "And I'll handle the customers, the product, the vision." It was not a negotiation, but a declaration of domains. She would be the face, the voice, the presence. He would ensure that beneath the performance lay a foundation of fiscal responsibility. In their small Queens apartment, as the radio played Bing Crosby's singing of love and longing, they drafted the blueprint for what would someday become an empire. The country clubs of Long Island became her finishing school in the early 1930s. Not as a member, Jews were rarely welcomed at establishments like the Maidstone or the Shinnecock Hills Golf Club, but as a visitor. A vendor, sometimes a tolerated interloper when a member took a special interest in her creams. Estée observed how wealth moved differently from mere money. The women who belonged to these clubs didn't just purchase differently, they inhabited their bodies differently. They stood straighter. Their gestures were more contained, more precise. They applied lipstick without mirrors, knowing exactly where their lips began and ended. "Your cream is divine," Mrs. Winthrop said one afternoon, her tennis whites immaculate despite the August heat. "Have you considered marketing it more, exclusively?" The question contained a world of implication. Exclusive meant expensive. It meant selective distribution, carefully controlled image. It meant moving away from bridge parties in Queens and toward something that required entirely different codes. "I'm considering several approaches," Estée replied, neither confirming nor denying. But the seed was planted. She watched how women touched the jars she presented, how they lingered over beautiful packaging, how they responded to French phrases, how they nodded appreciatively when ingredients were described as rare or specially sourced. Beauty was democratic, but luxury was not. The tension between those truths would define her career, though she didn't know it yet. The separation came in 1933, unexpected and painful. Details that would later be carefully excised from the official narrative. Joseph moved out of their apartment. Financial pressures, personality differences, the usual fracture lines that appear when young marriages collide with ambition and uncertainty. Estée threw herself into her work with renewed intensity. The country was in the depths of the Depression. Roosevelt had just taken office, promising a New Deal, but on the streets of New York, fear still hung like wood smoke in winter air. Yet even as banks failed and factories closed, Estée noticed something remarkable. Women still bought beauty products. They might sacrifice elsewhere. Cheaper cuts of meat, dresses mended instead of replaced, but lipstick sales held steady. A small luxury, a private defense against public hardship. "It's not frivolous," she told her sister when questioned about selling creams while neighbors went hungry. "It's essential. Hope is essential." Her products were not the cheapest, but they weren't the most expensive either. She positioned them carefully, aspirational but accessible, luxurious without being untouchable. A woman who couldn't afford a new coat might still treat herself to a jar of face cream that made her feel, for a moment, like the women who summered in the Hamptons. By 1935, something unexpected happened. Joseph returned. The reconciliation was as private as the separation had been. Later, they would revise this chapter of their story, smoothing over the rupture, presenting their marriage as uninterrupted. The truth was more complicated, as truth usually is. "I've missed your counsel," she told him, not quite saying she had missed him. "I've been watching your progress," he replied, not quite saying he had missed her. The business, still small, still more concept than corporation, had continued to grow despite the economic collapse around them. Joseph noticed immediately that her bookkeeping was haphazard, her inventory control non-existent. Yet somehow she had expanded her customer base, refined her formulations, developed an instinct for exactly how much to charge for the transaction to feel significant without being prohibitive. They remarried quietly, both a bit older, both a bit wiser about the boundaries of their partnership. He would manage what happened behind the scenes. She would control everything the customer saw, felt, and believed. Miami Beach, 1935. A different world from Queens. Art Deco hotels gleaming white against blue skies. Palm trees swaying in salt-tinged breezes. And cabanas rows of private changing rooms where the wealthy emerged from one identity and slipped into another. Estée had convinced Joseph that they should spend part of the winter here not just for pleasure but for research. The northern rich flocked to Florida during the cold months, creating a concentration of potential customers that would take months to reach in New York. "Madam, would you care for a complimentary massage?" she asked, approaching women as they lounged by the pool of the Raleigh Hotel. "I've developed a special suntan oil that nourishes the skin while it protects." The genius was in the word complimentary. Few could resist something offered freely, especially when it came with the intimate pleasure of human touch. Estée's hands were strong, confident, trained by years of demonstrating creams and lotions. As she massaged the oil into shoulders tightened by social anxiety, into backs that bore the invisible weight of maintaining appearance, she talked, softly, hypnotically. "You have such lovely skin texture," she would murmur. "This oil has a special formula with rare botanical ingredients that help maintain that natural glow." By the time the massage ended, a relationship had been established. Not friendship exactly, but something adjacent to it. A connection founded on touch, on vulnerability, on the shared conspiracy of beauty maintenance. "I'd like to purchase a bottle," the woman would inevitably say, reaching for her purse. "Of course," Estée would reply, as if this outcome were coincidental rather than orchestrated. By the end of their Miami stay, she had refined a technique that would become the cornerstone of her future empire. The free sample, the gift with purchase, the small generosity that created a sense of obligation. It wasn't manipulation exactly. The products were good, the experience genuine, but it was strategy, carefully calibrated to human psychology. "People remember what you give them," she told Joseph as they packed to return north, "and they feel compelled to give something in return." He nodded, impressed despite his natural caution. "You've developed quite a system." "Not a system," she corrected, "a language. I'm learning to speak directly to what women want, even when they don't have words for it themselves." Back in New York, spring was just beginning to soften the hard edges of the city. The Depression maintained its grip, but there were signs of recovery, construction projects restarting, shops that had been shuttered cautiously reopening. Roosevelt's programs were creating jobs, restoring a measure of confidence to a traumatized nation. Estée and Joseph sat at their kitchen table, tallying the winter's profits. The Miami experiment had been successful beyond their expectations. Not just in immediate sales, but in connections established, in techniques refined, in confidence gained. "We should consider proper packaging," Joseph suggested, reviewing her notes on customer reactions. "If they respond to prestige, we should invest in containers that communicate that." Estée nodded, seeing the wisdom in his analysis. Glass jars, perhaps, with gold lids. She sketched quickly on a notepad. Simple but substantial, nothing gaudy. They worked late into the evening, two immigrants' children planning an assault on the established beauty industry. Outside, Duke Ellington played on someone's radio, the music drifting through an open window. The world was still in turmoil, but in their small apartment, something was being built, a vision that extended far beyond creams and lotions. "We'll need a proper name," Joseph said as midnight approached. "Something that sounds elegant, established." Estée looked at her own handwriting on the page before her, the script she had practiced for years, making her signature more flowing, more sophisticated than her queen's upbringing would suggest. "I've been using Estée," she said, "and we could refine our surname, Lauder instead of Lauder, Estée Lauder." Joseph tested it, speaking the name aloud. Estée. It had a rhythm, a presence. It sounded like it belonged on a fine jar of cream, like it had history behind it. What neither of them said, what perhaps neither fully realized, was that they were not just naming a product line. They were crafting an origin story, a persona, a mythology that would one day be worth billions. The girl from Corona, Queens, the indifferent student, the immigrant's daughter, was becoming someone else, someone whose name would eventually be spoken with reverence in the finest stores in the world. Outside, the city continued its restless sleep, unaware that in a modest apartment, the architecture of an American fortune was being sketched on kitchen stationery, dream by practical dream. The late autumn rain tapped against the tall windows of Estée's modest New York office like a hesitant visitor. Outside, the gray skies of 1939 hung over a city still clawing its way out of economic depression. Inside, Estée stood before stacks of elegant cream-colored boxes, each containing jars of her super-rich all-purpose creme, each representing a fraction of the $5,000 she had invested and lost. 6 months, she murmured, running her fingertips along the embossed lid of the nearest jar. 6 months in Rexall drugstores across the city, and they're all coming back. Her business partner and husband, Joseph Lauder, examined the shipping manifest with a furrowed brow. The drugstore manager said customers just weren't willing to spend that much on face cream when they could get Pond's for half the price. Estée's lips pressed into a thin line. She was a small woman, barely over 5 feet tall, but possessed a presence that could command a room. At 31, her dark hair was impeccably styled, her makeup flawless, a walking advertisement for her products and philosophy. "It's not the product," she said with sudden certainty. "It's the setting." She paced the small room, the heels of her shoes clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The walls were lined with shelves of creams and lotions, formulations she'd perfected over years of experimentation. Each represented countless hours of work, demonstrating at beauty salons, hosting parties in private homes, convincing women one by one that beauty was within their reach. "Premium requires premium context," she said, more to herself than to Joseph. "We can't sell luxury next to aspirin and toothpaste under fluorescent lights." The lesson crystallized for her as she spoke. Her $5,000, a fortune in 1939 when many Americans earned less than $1,000 annually, had bought her valuable knowledge. Estée Lauder products didn't belong in drugstores. They belonged in environments where women felt special, where the experience itself was part of the allure. Joseph nodded slowly. "So we focus on the demonstrations, the beauty salons, the direct approach." "Exactly," Estée said, her confidence returning. "Control the environment, control the experience." Through the window, She could see the first snowflakes of winter beginning to fall. Below, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, collars turned up against the cold. Newspapers in their hands carried grim headlines about Hitler's march across Europe. The world was changing rapidly, but Estée's determination remained constant. "You simply must try it, darling," Estée said to the elegantly dressed woman seated before her in the plush chair of Gertrude Schultz's Upper East Side salon. "Your skin deserves to be pampered." It was 1940, and despite the unsettling news from Europe, New York's social scene continued its careful dance. Women still attended bridge parties, still visited beauty salons, still sought the comfort and confidence that came with looking their best. With gentle, practiced movements, Estée applied her cream to one half of the woman's face. "Now, feel the difference," she encouraged, guiding the woman's hand to her cheek. "It does feel smoother," the woman admitted, her resistance melting. "And look at the glow," Estée added, holding up a mirror. The contrast between the treated and untreated sides was subtle but unmistakable. Estée had perfected this demonstration over countless repetitions. She knew exactly when to speak, when to remain silent, when to touch a client's hand in reassurance. Her success rate had climbed steadily now. Over 70% of women who received her demonstrations made a purchase. "I'll take 2 jars," the woman decided. Later, after the salon had emptied, Gertrude approached Estée as she packed her samples. "You have a gift," Gertrude said, lighting a cigarette. "3 of my regular clients asked when you'd be back." Estée smiled. "I'll return next Thursday, and I'll bring my new cleansing oil." "Have you considered approaching Saks? Their cosmetics counter would be perfect for your products." Estée's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm working on department stores, but I want more than a counter. I want control over how my products are presented, who sells them, how they're demonstrated." The radio in the corner played Glenn Miller's "In the Mood," while outside, the streets had dimmed under wartime lighting restrictions. The news that day had been filled with reports of German U-boats threatening Atlantic shipping lanes. Gertrude exhaled a plume of smoke. "You sound like Helena Rubinstein. That woman runs her company like a general." At the mention of Rubinstein, Estée's attention sharpened. "Speaking of Helena, is she still hosting those charity events at the plaza?" "Next Saturday, I believe." "Why?" "Professional curiosity," Estée replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's always instructive to observe the competition." The Plaza Hotel ballroom glittered with chandeliers and jewels as New York's elite gathered for Helena Rubinstein's charity gala in support of European refugees. It was 1941, and while the United States had not yet entered the war, the conflict's shadow stretched across the Atlantic. Estée circulated through the crowd with practiced ease. She wore a midnight blue evening gown, not from Paris, but an excellent New York copy that looked the part. Joseph stood near the bar, making business connections while she focused on her real purpose, studying Helena Rubinstein. The cosmetics maven held court across the room, a diminutive woman of 69 with an imperious bearing. Despite her age, Rubinstein commanded attention with her European accent, her artistic knowledge, and her business acumen. She had built an international empire on her skincare formulations and her aura of exotic expertise. Estée observed Rubinstein's interactions, how she spoke to potential clients, how she maintained eye contact, how she conveyed authority through subtle gestures. It wasn't merely envy that drove Estée's observation. It was strategic reconnaissance. "She's quite something, isn't she?" a voice said beside her. Estée turned to find a fashion editor she recognized from Harper's Bazaar. "Remarkable," Estée agreed, "though her approach is very European. And yours?" "Distinctly American," Estée said without hesitation. "Helena speaks to women from a position of authority. I speak to them as a friend." The editor smiled. "An interesting distinction, though it seems to be working for her." "For now," Estée replied with quiet confidence. "But America is changing. Women don't want to be lectured about beauty. They want to be guided toward it." Later that evening, as they rode home in a taxi through the dimmed streets of wartime New York, Joseph looked at his wife with curiosity. "Did you learn anything useful?" Estée gazed out at the darkened storefronts. "Helena's biggest advantage is her mystique, her European background, her scientific claims. But her weakness is her distance. She doesn't connect with the average American woman. And that's your strength." "One of many," she said with a smile. "I'm developing what I call counter-control. Not just selling products, but creating an entire experience. Trained demonstrators who understand my techniques. Exclusive placement, personal oversight of every detail." Joseph shook his head in admiration. Most people would have given up after the Rexall failure. "Most people aren't me," Estée replied simply. December 7th, 1941, changed everything. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America into the global conflict, and overnight, the nation's economy shifted to a wartime footing. Men disappeared into uniform. Women filled factories. Rationing became a patriotic duty. In Estée's small office, the radio brought news of Allied setbacks in the Pacific while she reviewed her inventory lists. Certain ingredients were becoming scarce, metal containers nearly impossible to obtain. Yet cosmetics themselves remained unrationed, a deliberate decision by the government which recognized their importance to civilian morale. "Maintaining beauty is now a patriotic duty," Estée told her small staff of demonstrators. Women working in factories, volunteering with the Red Cross, managing households alone. They need to feel confident and strong. She adjusted her marketing approach accordingly. Her advertisements, modest as they were, emphasized resilience and American optimism. While she couldn't compete with Revlon's patriotic Fatal Apple red lipstick, popular among WACs and nurses, she positioned her skincare as essential self-care during trying times. The war years brought material challenges, but also opportunities. As imported European cosmetics vanished from the market, American brands gained ground. Department stores, facing inventory shortages in many categories, became more receptive to new cosmetic lines that could attract customers. By 1943, Estée had refined her approach through thousands of demonstrations. Her technique was a carefully choreographed dance, the gentle application, the personal touch, the well-timed compliment. She trained her demonstrators with military precision, insisting they memorize her scripts and techniques exactly. "Never ask if a woman wants a demonstration," she instructed a new hire at a training session in her apartment. "Instead say, 'Let me show you how this will make you look younger.' Never ask if she wants to buy. Say, 'Which shade would you prefer? Would you like 1 jar or 2? The young woman nodded earnestly, taking notes. And remember, Estée continued, we are not merely selling cream. We are selling hope, confidence, beauty itself. In the spring of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Normandy, Estée sat in the hushed elegance of the tea room at Saks Fifth Avenue. Across from her, the store's cosmetics buyer sipped Earl Grey and considered her proposal. Your products have developed quite a following at those salons you work with, he acknowledged. But counter space is precious, Mrs. Lauder. Helena Rubinstein, Elizabeth Arden, Dorothy Gray, they've been with us for years. Estée leaned forward slightly. And they've grown comfortable, complacent. I'm offering something different, not just products, but an experience. Meaning? My demonstrators are trained to do more than sell. They create relationships. My customers don't just buy once, they come back again and again. She paused. 70% of women who receive my demonstration make a purchase. Can Helena Rubinstein say the same? The buyer raised an eyebrow, impressed despite himself. You're proposing your own staff at the counter? Trained by me personally. With distinctive uniforms, I'm thinking a soft blue like this, she said, showing him a fabric swatch. The counter itself should convey luxury proper lighting, elegant displays. The environment matters as much as the product. That's a significant investment on our part. And mine, Estée countered, but I know the return will justify it. Outside on Fifth Avenue, women in practical wartime fashions passed by. Many wore factory coveralls or nurses' uniforms, their hairstyles adapted for safety and convenience. Yet lipstick remained a constant, a small defiance against austerity and worry. The buyer set down his teacup. We could try a limited counter, 3 months in a secondary location. I'd prefer 6 months, Estée negotiated smoothly, in a location with proper foot traffic, and I'd want to train your staff myself. After further discussion, they reached an agreement. It wasn't everything Estée wanted, but it was a foothold in the prestigious department store, a far cry from the Rexall drugstore debacle of 1939. As she left Saks, Estée allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. 5 years earlier, she had learned a painful lesson about premium products requiring premium contexts. Now she was putting that knowledge to work, creating environments where her creams and lotions could be properly appreciated and properly priced. I understand Saks has given you a counter, Helena Rubinstein said, her accent still heavy despite decades in America. Congratulations. It was autumn 1944, and they stood in the marble-floored reception area of a charity event at the Waldorf Astoria. The hotel's grandeur was muted by wartime restrictions, the lighting dimmer, the menu adapted to rationing, but it remained a gathering place for New York's elite. Estée met the older woman's gaze with composed dignity. Thank you. I've admired your business for many years. It is not easy, this business, Rubinstein continued, especially now with shortages, but you are persistent. I have noticed you at many events over the years. The observation confirmed what Estée had suspected. Her reconnaissance had not gone unnoticed by its subject. I believe in learning from the best, she replied diplomatically. Rubinstein's painted lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The cosmetics world is small, Mrs. Lauder. We will see much of each other in years to come. After Rubinstein moved away to greet other guests, Joseph appeared at Estée's side. What did Helena Rubinstein want? To size up the competition, Estée said, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, and to let me know she's been aware of me all along. Does that concern you? On the contrary, Estée replied, it confirms I'm on the right path. By early 1945, as the war in Europe moved toward its bloody conclusion, Estée's counter at Saks was exceeding expectations. Her disciplined approach to demonstrations, combined with her insistence on trained staff and controlled presentation, produced sales figures that impressed even the skeptical buyer who had given her the chance. She never spoke publicly about the years of struggle, the bridge parties, the salon demonstrations, the Rexall failure. Instead, she began crafting a narrative of swift success, of overnight recognition, a story more appealing than the long grind of persistence against repeated setbacks. People respond to success, she told Joseph one evening as they reviewed the week's sales figures in their apartment. They want to associate with winners. Outside their window, Times Square erupted in celebration as news broke of Germany's surrender. VE Day had arrived at last. The war in Europe was over. In the coming months, as servicemen returned and the nation pivoted toward peacetime, Estée stood at the threshold of expansion. The lessons of the hard years, 1936 to 1945, had formed the foundation of her approach. Premium products required premium environments. Controlled demonstration led to reliable sales. Personal relationships built customer loyalty, and above all, the experience surrounding the product mattered as much as the product itself. The drugstore failure of 1939 had not defeated her. Instead, it had clarified her vision and strengthened her resolve. As the post-war economic boom gathered momentum, Estée was positioned to grow from a small entrepreneurial venture into something much larger, though few. Even those closest to her could have predicted just how far she would go. The late afternoon light slanted through the windows of the small Central Park West apartment, catching motes of dust that danced over jars and bottles arranged with meticulous precision on the kitchen table. Estée moved her slender fingers over each container, adjusting them into perfect alignment as she had done countless times before. The kitchen converted into an impromptu laboratory and office, smelled of roses, lanolin, and ambition. "Joseph," she called to her husband in the next room, "could you help me with these labels?" It was 1946, mere months after they had officially founded Estée Lauder Inc., transforming years of kitchen table experimentation into something with real potential. 4 employees, just the 2 of them, plus 2 assistants, and 12 carefully crafted products represented the sum total of their enterprise. But Estée saw beyond the modest surroundings, beyond the cramped kitchen where she mixed her creams by hand. She saw counters in the finest department stores, women across America touching their faces after using her products, feeling beautiful and knowing why. Joseph appeared in the doorway, rolling up his shirt sleeves. "How many do we need for tomorrow's delivery?" 3 dozen at least, she said, carefully pouring a thick cream into a glass jar. "The salon is selling faster than we anticipated." The House of Ash Blonde Salon on 52nd Street had been their first meaningful foothold, a concession that allowed Estée to demonstrate her products directly to women while they sat for hair appointments. The arrangement was elegant in its simplicity, captive customers, already in a beauty mindset, with Estée moving among them like a priestess of transformation. $800 last week, Joseph mused, applying labels with steady hands. If we maintain that pace. Estée cut him off with a gentle touch to his wrist. "We won't just maintain it, we'll double it by year's end." Her certainty wasn't bravado, but calculation. She had learned through years of demonstration that the product itself was only half the equation. The other half was the performance, the touch, the personal attention, the moment when a woman saw herself anew in the mirror. That couldn't be bottled, but it could be choreographed. And Estée was its most skilled choreographer. Later that evening, after the kitchen had been returned to some semblance of domesticity, Estée sat at their modest dining table reviewing the week's orders. The apartment was comfortable but far from luxurious, a stepping stone, not a destination. Through the partially opened window came the distant sounds of taxis honking on Central Park West, the occasional clip-clop of a horse-drawn carriage taking evening tourists through the park. "We need to think beyond the salon," she said, pushing aside a plate that held the remains of a simple dinner. "Department stores are where real volume happens." Joseph looked up from his newspaper headlines screaming about Truman's policies and the developing Cold War, and considered his wife's expression. He recognized that look, determination crystallized into strategy. "Saks Fifth Avenue," she continued, tapping a pencil against her ledger book. "That's where we need to be. Estée, they'll never give counter space to someone working out of a kitchen. They have Revlon, Elizabeth Arden established names." She smiled, not at him, but at a vision only she could see. "They don't have me." The following Tuesday, Estée stood in the marble-floored cosmetics department of Saks Fifth Avenue watching. She wore her best suit navy blue with subtle shoulder pads, not flashy but impeccably tailored, and carried a small case containing her most effective products. For 2 hours, she observed the rhythms of the counter, which saleswomen connected with customers, which products were touched but not purchased, which women left without buying anything at all. She wasn't there by appointment. That was the Lauder method, what would later be known among her small staff as the Saks ambush. Study first, then strike when the moment was right. The cosmetics buyer, a stern woman named Mrs. Hamilton with perfectly coiffed gray hair, emerged from a side office, clipboard in hand. Before she could begin her rounds, Estée intercepted her with a warm smile and extended hand. "Mrs. Hamilton, I'm Estée Lauder. I've been hoping to discuss an opportunity that could increase your cosmetics revenue substantially." The buyer's eyebrow arched. "Do you have an appointment, Mrs. Lauder?" "I have something better," Estée replied, opening her case. "I have solutions to 3 problems I've observed at your counter in just the past 2 hours." Interest flickered across Mrs. Hamilton's face despite her professional reserve. "And those would be?" "First, your saleswomen demonstrate products but don't connect them to the customer's life. Second, your sampling is inconsistent. Some customers receive it, others don't. And third," she paused, ensuring she had the buyer's full attention, "you're losing sales in the critical final moments when a woman hesitates before purchase." What followed was not merely a product pitch, but a vision of controlled retail theater. Estée described how she would train the Saks saleswomen personally, how each customer would receive the Lauder touch, along with personalized samples, how the counter itself would become a stage for transformation. Mrs. Hamilton's skepticism gradually gave way to curiosity. "And your line consists of 12 essential products, each formulated to work with the others. Not the most extensive line on your floor, but perhaps soon the most profitable per square foot." By the time Estée left Saks that afternoon, she had secured not a promise but a challenge. Bring her products the following week for a formal presentation to the entire cosmetics department. It wasn't a counter knot yet, but it was a door opened through sheer force of will. $800, Estée said, holding the initial purchase order from Saks like a precious document. It was the spring of 1948, nearly 2 years after founding the company, and the kitchen laboratory had expanded to include part of the living room. It's modest, but it's Saks Fifth Avenue. Joseph looked up from the formulation he was adjusting. And if they sell through quickly? When they sell through, she corrected. I'll be at that counter 3 days a week, showing their saleswomen exactly how to connect with customers. By Christmas, we'll be doing 10 times this volume. The Saks counter became Estée's true laboratory, not for products, but for selling psychology. She arrived before the store opened, immaculately dressed, and left after closing. She demonstrated on customers, then watched as saleswomen attempted to replicate her approach. When they succeeded, she praised specifically. When they faltered, she stepped in seamlessly to complete the sale. "You don't sell the cream," she instructed a young saleswoman one afternoon as fall leaves skittered past the Fifth Avenue windows. "You sell the promise, and then you make sure the cream delivers. That's why we give samples. A woman tries it, feels the difference, and comes back for the full size." Her insistence on personal demonstrations wasn't merely technique, it was philosophy. "Control the counter, control the customer," she would murmur to Joseph at night while reviewing sales figures that climbed steadily upward. By the close of 1948, that initial 800 order had multiplied. Saks reordered monthly, and the tiny company's revenue approached numbers that seemed impossible for a business still partially operated from a kitchen. The winter of 1949 brought both bitter cold to New York City and expansive opportunity to Estée Lauder, Inc. They had taken a small office space primarily for shipping and receiving, though product development and oversight remained in the apartment. The company now employed 6 people, still tiny compared to the cosmetic giants, but growing with disciplined purpose. Estée sat across from her accountant in a corner booth at Lindy's, picking at a slice of their famous cheesecake while he reviewed their year-end statements. "Mrs. Lauder, you've achieved something remarkable," he said, adjusting his glasses as he studied the ledger. "Revenue approaching $500,000 for the year, with margins holding at 20%. That's exceptional for a company so young. And our reinvestment strategy? Conservative but sound. You're building substantial value inside the company rather than extracting it. Unusual for a family business, but forward-thinking." She nodded, satisfied. Nearly $100,000 in retained earnings wealth, accumulating not as lavish living, but as business infrastructure. The Upper West Side apartment remained their home, modest by the standards of their growing success. What mattered wasn't immediate comfort but lasting control. "We'll need more counters," she said, making a note in her small leather-bound planner. "Neiman Marcus in Dallas, Marshall Field's in Chicago. The formula works in New York. It will work nationally." The summer of 1950 found Estée in the courtyard of the Plaza Hotel, taking afternoon tea with Leonard Lauder, her elder son, home from his first year at college. Now that the company approached the $500,000 annual revenue mark, she allowed herself small luxuries like this, moments of genteel celebration hidden within strategic conversations. "I don't understand why you and Dad still live in the same apartment," Leonard said, stirring sugar into his tea. "You could afford something much larger now." Estée smiled, watching well-dressed New Yorkers move through the plaza's elegant space. Women in summer dresses and gloves, men in light suits. Many of the women, she noted with satisfaction, likely had Estée Lauder products on their vanities. "The business needs its capital more than we need a new apartment," she replied. "Every dollar we keep inside the company becomes $2 next year. Every dollar we spend on ourselves is just gone." She didn't add what experience had taught her, that, in the beauty business, perception of success was essential to creating success, but displaying wealth too ostentatiously could alienate the very women she wanted as customers. The balance was delicate. Appear successful enough to be aspirational, but accessible enough to be trusted. "Besides," she added, "our future isn't in real estate. It's in controlling as many department store counters as possible." "Every counter is a stage, Leonard. Every demonstration is a performance. That's how we've grown from nothing to this in 4 years." Leonard considered his mother's words, recognizing in them the blueprint of a business philosophy that was already proving extraordinarily effective. And Saks, how is that account performing now? $60,000 this year from an initial $800 order. Pride flickered across her face. And that's just one counter in one store. In their Central Park West apartment that autumn evening, Estée reviewed the latest batch of sales reports spread across the dining table. The kitchen no longer served as the primary laboratory. They had proper facilities for that now, but she still occasionally mixed small batches there, testing adjustments to their formulations. Joseph entered, loosening his tie after a day overseeing production. The shipping department called. Marshall Fields wants to increase their order for the Christmas season. Estée nodded, unsurprised. "By how much?" 40% over projection. She made a note in the margin of her sales ledger. 4 years after founding the company with 4 employees and 12 products mixed in this very kitchen, they had expanded into 3 major cities, employed 17 people, and were on track to finish 1950 with over $500,000 in revenue. "I spoke with the lease agent today," Joseph said, pouring himself a small scotch. "The office space next to our current location is available. We could expand, move all the inventory management out of here." Estée closed her ledger and joined him by the window. Central Park sprawled before them, trees shedding their autumn colors, the lights of Fifth Avenue buildings glowing in the early darkness. Somewhere in those buildings, women were preparing for evening engagements, touching Estée Lauder creams to their faces, participating in a ritual she had orchestrated. "Do it," she said, "but make sure we maintain our cash position. We're still only at the beginning." She didn't articulate her full vision, that this was merely the foundation of something that would extend far beyond luxury department stores, beyond New York, beyond even American borders. That would come in time. For now, she was content to build methodically, counter by counter, customer by customer. Each demonstration adding not just to their revenue, but to the mythology of Estée, a woman who understood other women's aspirations and had bottled them into something tangible. Control the counter, control the customer, build an empire, one face at a time. The scent of perfumed jasmine, rose, and something earthy filled the glass-walled conference room at 666 Fifth Avenue. Outside, 1952 Manhattan pulsed with post-war energy. Yellow cabs crawling through midday traffic, men in fedoras and women in tailored suits disappearing into department stores, their arms soon to be laden with packages wrapped in crisp paper. Inside, Estée stood at the head of a mahogany table, her petite frame commanding the attention of 6 men in dark suits. At 44, she carried herself with the practiced elegance of someone who understood that appearance was currency. Her chestnut hair was swept into a perfect coiffure, her makeup flawless, not because she was vain, but because she was her own best advertisement. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and confident despite the resistance she felt building in the room, "I've called you here because we're at a crossroads." Joseph, her husband and business partner, sat to her right. He watched her with the mixture of admiration and wariness that had defined their relationship since their reconciliation after their brief divorce years earlier. The other men, financial advisors and marketing executives, exchanged glances. Mrs. Lauder began one of them, a silver-haired man who had spent 20 years in the fragrance industry. "We've reviewed your proposal. Frankly, we think it's too risky." Estée smiled. Not the warm smile she used at cosmetic counters when showing society women how to apply creams and powders, but the determined smile that appeared when someone underestimated her. "Tell me what troubles you about Youth Dew," she said, gesturing to the amber bottle on the table. "It's a bath oil that doubles as a perfume," the man continued. "The concept is unusual. Women expect perfume to be a gift, something precious. Their husbands buy them for Christmas or anniversaries." Joseph cleared his throat. "The market research suggests he's right, Estée. European imports dominate. Chanel No. 5, Arpege, they're what women aspire to own." "And they cost $25 an ounce," Estée replied. "That's a week's worth of groceries for many families." She walked to the window, watching as the late autumn sun cast long shadows across Fifth Avenue. The street below represented everything she was aiming for: prestige, elegance, the pinnacle of American commerce. But unlike many of the businesses housed in the towering buildings, she understood something fundamental about the post-war American woman. "Women don't want to wait for special occasions," she said softly. "Not anymore, not after everything they did during the war. They want to feel beautiful every day." She turned back to the room. "Youth Dew will be different. 12 ounces for $8.50. Not cheap enough to seem common, but accessible enough for a woman to buy for herself. A bath oil that leaves a lingering fragrance, giving her permission to purchase it as a practical luxury." "But the profit margins," one of the advisors began. "Will be fine," Estée interrupted, "because women will use it daily, not save it for special occasions. They'll finish a bottle and buy another." She returned to her seat, her movements deliberate and graceful. "There's something else none of you have considered," she continued. "Women talk. They always have. When one woman smells wonderful, her friends notice. They ask what she's wearing. Telephone, telegraph, tell a woman. That's how news really spreads." Joseph smiled at the phrase. He'd heard her say it countless times in their kitchen when they first started mixing creams in their Queens apartment. Now here they were, in a Manhattan skyscraper, with a company that was growing beyond what either of them had imagined. "We'll accompany every sale with samples," Estée added. 5, maybe 10 little vials with each purchase. Women will give them to friends, to coworkers. Each sample is a seed. The room grew quiet as the men calculated the costs, the risks, the potential. Estée didn't press them. She'd learned that silence was often the most persuasive argument. Finally, Joseph spoke. "I think we should trust Estée on this. She's never been wrong about what women want." The department store glittered under the artificial brightness of strategically placed lights. The cosmetics floor smelled like a garden crossed with a pharmacy, floral notes floating over antiseptic undertones. Estée watched from behind a column as a customer approached the Estée counter. The saleswoman, dressed in a crisp white lab coat, her hair set in perfect waves, greeted the customer with a warm smile. Estée had personally trained her, along with every other woman who represented the brand. The greeting, the touch, the sample, the close-it, it was a carefully choreographed performance. "Would you like to try our new bath oil?" the saleswoman asked, producing the amber bottle of Youth Dew. The customer, a well-dressed woman in her 30s, hesitated. "I usually wear Chanel." "Of course," the saleswoman nodded appreciatively. "Youth Dew isn't meant to replace your special occasion fragrance. It's for everyday luxury. May I?" She demonstrated, pouring a few drops into the woman's palm, instructing her to breathe in the rich scent, spices, flowers, amber. Then she explained how just a few drops in the bath would turn an ordinary routine into a moment of indulgence. The woman was intrigued, and it stays on the skin afterward. "Like a lingering memory," the saleswoman confirmed. "And if you purchase today, Mrs. Lauder has insisted we include these." She produced a small velvet pouch containing sample vials. "For your friends who will inevitably ask what wonderful scent you're wearing." Estée smiled as she watched the woman make the purchase. The reciprocity loop was perfect. The samples created an obligation, and women fulfilled it by telling others about Youth Dew. It wasn't just marketing. It was psychology, sociology, and intimate knowledge of how women related to one another. Later that evening, in the quiet of her office, Estée reviewed the early sales figures. Youth Dew was moving faster than projected. She ran her fingers over the ledger, the numbers confirming what she already knew in her bones. She had created something that resonated. Joseph entered with 2 cups of coffee. "You should come home," he said gently. "It's past 8. "Look at these numbers," she replied, turning the ledger toward him. "We might sell 10,000 units by Christmas." He studied the figures. "You were right," he admitted, again. She accepted the coffee and took a sip. "I understand women because I am one. I know what it feels like to want beautiful things, to want to feel beautiful, and to have to be practical about money all at the same time." Joseph sat across from her. In the soft light of the office, with Manhattan glittering beyond the windows, they could have been back in their kitchen in Queens, dreaming of what might be possible. "If these projections hold," he said, "we could be looking at $1 million in revenue within a few years." Estée nodded. $1 million had once seemed an impossible sum. Now it felt like just the beginning. By 1953, Youth Dew wasn't just a success, it was a phenomenon. The factory could barely keep pace with demand. Department stores across the country called daily, increasing their orders. Women who had never spent money on expensive perfumes were buying Youth Dew, using it daily, and coming back for more. 50,000 units sold in the first year, far beyond their most optimistic projections. And Estée's strategy of generous sampling was paying dividends. Each bottle seemed to sell 3 more through word of mouth. In her new office, Larger and more elegantly appointed than the previous one, Estée met with Arnold Louis von Emeringen, a respected figure in the fragrance world who controlled access to Europe's finest ingredients. "Mrs. Lauder," he said, his Dutch accent still present despite decades in America. "I must admit I was skeptical when we first met." Another cosmetics company, I thought. "But what you've accomplished with Youth Dew is remarkable." "Thank you, Arnold," she replied. "But I suspect you didn't come here just to compliment me." He smiled. Direct, as always. "No, I came to discuss expanding your supply chain. Youth Dew requires specific ingredients, oils from France, botanicals from Italy. With your current growth, you'll need more reliable sourcing. And you can provide that? I can open doors in Europe that would otherwise remain closed to an American company, especially one as young as yours." Estée considered the offer. Expanding meant risk, but she'd built her business on calculated risks. "I believe every woman has the right to be beautiful," she said finally. "Not just the wealthy, not just the privileged. To deliver on that promise, I need the finest ingredients available." "Then we have an understanding," von Emeringen said, extending his hand. The partnership would prove crucial in the years ahead, giving Estée access to suppliers and formulations that elevated her products above the competition, while maintaining quality at scale, something many companies sacrificed as they grew. By 1958, Estée and Joseph Lauder had become millionaires. They moved from their comfortable but modest home to a Park Avenue apartment, an address that was itself a credential in New York society. The walls were soon adorned with carefully selected art, impressionist paintings, a small but significant Picasso. "It's beautiful," Estée said one evening, standing before a Renoir they'd recently acquired. The painting depicted a woman at her toilette, her expression serene as she prepared herself for the day, or perhaps an evening out. "The art dealer says it's a good investment," Joseph noted. Estée shook her head slightly. "I didn't buy it as an investment. I bought it because it's beautiful, because it reminds me why we do what we do." Joseph understood. For Estée, beauty wasn't frivolous. It was essential, a way of asserting one's humanity in a world that often seemed designed to diminish it. Her cosmetics weren't just products. They were tools of transformation, of self-expression, of dignity. Later that week, in the wood-paneled dining room of an exclusive Manhattan restaurant, Estée sat across from the buyer for a major department store chain. The room hummed with quiet conversation, the clink of silver against fine china, the subtle notes of a pianist playing Cole Porter in the corner. "Mrs. Lauder," the buyer said, "your Youth Dew accounts for nearly 80% of your revenue. Doesn't that concern you?" Estée took a sip of water. "Not at all," she replied. "It tells me we've created something women truly want, but more importantly, it gives us the foundation to expand." She reached into her handbag and produced a small jar. "This is our new face cream. The formulation is revolutionary lightweight, but deeply moisturizing. And like Youth Dew, it will come with our gift with purchase promotion." The buyer raised an eyebrow. "The other cosmetics companies have started copying that approach, you know." Estée smiled. "Good. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but they're always one step behind, aren't they?" It was true. By the time competitors adopted her gift with purchase strategy, Estée was already refining it, making the gifts more desirable, more tailored to each customer. The sample sizes were generous enough to create a real experience, not just a token. "I'll increase the order for Youth Dew," the buyer decided, "and I'll take an initial order of the face cream for our flagship stores." "You won't regret it," Estée assured him. "Women will come to your counter specifically for these products, and while they're there, they'll look at everything else you offer." The Lauder home became a subtle symbol of their success. Tasteful, elegant, but never ostentatious. Estée understood that true wealth whispered, it didn't shout. The Park Avenue address, the art collection, the discreet but unmistakable quality of everything from the furnishings to the silver, these were the markers of having arrived. But even as she embraced the trappings of success, Estée remained focused on the business. She still visited department stores regularly, sometimes announced, often not. She would observe the saleswomen, the customers, the interactions at the counter. Occasionally, if she saw an opportunity to make a sale, she would step in, never identifying herself until after the purchase was complete. Mrs. Lauder, a saleswoman at Saks, gasped one afternoon, recognizing her employer only after Estée had helped sell a complete skincare regimen to a reluctant customer. "You were doing beautifully," Estée assured her. "I just couldn't help myself." The truth was, she loved the sale, not just for the revenue, but for the connection. Every woman who came to an Estée Lauder counter was looking for something more than cream or powder or perfume. They were looking for transformation, for confidence, for a version of themselves that existed just beyond reach. Estée understood that hunger because she had felt it herself. In the evenings, when the business day was done, Estée and Joseph would sometimes sit in their living room, surrounded by their growing art collection, and marvel at how far they had come. "Did you ever think, back when we were mixing creams in that kitchen in Queens, that we would end up here?" Joseph asked one night. Estée considered the question. "Yes," she said finally. "Not the details, not Park Avenue or the Renoir or the millions. But I knew we would succeed because I never doubted what women wanted. They want to feel beautiful. They want to feel valued. They want products that deliver on their promises." She glanced at the ledger on the coffee table, the latest sales figures for Youth Dew, showing no signs of slowing. By some estimates, it now accounted for over 80% of the company's revenue. "We've built something lasting, Joseph," she said. "Something that will outlive us both." Outside, the lights of Manhattan glowed against the night sky. Inside, surrounded by beauty they had earned through persistence and insight, Estée and Joseph Lauder contemplated their next moves in a business that had become not just their livelihood, but their legacy. The scent of Youth Dew lingered in the air familiar now, but no less intoxicating than when Estée had first insisted, against all advice, that women would buy perfume for themselves if only someone gave them permission to do so. It was that insight, that deep understanding of desire and propriety and their delicate interplay, that had transformed Estée from a kitchen table operation into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. And it was only the beginning. The January air in London hung like a veil of gray cashmere as Estée stood before the imposing facade of Harrods. Big Ben had just chimed 9 in the distance, and already the sidewalks of Knightsbridge hummed with the quiet bustle of a city still rebuilding itself from war. Women in tailored coats and men in dark suits passed by, their breath forming small clouds in the winter chill. "I haven't come all the way across the Atlantic to be turned away," Estée murmured to herself, adjusting her silk scarf and straightening her spine. At 52, she carried herself with the precision of a woman who understood that appearance was currency. Inside her leather handbag rested several small blue jars of her Youth Dew bath oil, each one nestled in tissue paper. They were her soldiers, her diplomats. They would say what her queen's accent might not convey to British ears. The doorman nodded respectfully as she passed, unaware that the petite, elegantly dressed woman was about to execute what her team back home had nicknamed the Harrod's cold call. No appointment, no invitation. Just determination and a fragrance that had already begun transforming American department stores. The cosmetics hall greeted her with its cathedral quiet and amber lighting. Glass cases gleamed like jewel boxes, showcasing the established royalty of beauty. Guerlain, Yardley, Lancôme, European names. Old world prestige. Nothing American held court here. "I'm looking for the cosmetics buyer," she said to a woman behind one of the counters, her voice warm but firm. "Would you be kind enough to point me in the right direction?" 20 minutes later, Estée sat across from Harold Jenkins, Harrod's cosmetics buyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a skeptical mouth. His office smelled of Earl Grey tea and leather-bound ledgers. "Mrs. Lauder," he began, "while we appreciate your enthusiasm, Harrod's maintains very selective relationships with our beauty suppliers, primarily European houses with established—" "Mr. Jenkins," she interrupted gently, "I understand tradition. But I also understand women. May I propose something unconventional? Give me a counter. Just for today. Let me demonstrate what Estée can do for Harrod's customers." Jenkins' eyebrows rose. "That's highly irregular." "So is success sometimes," Estée replied, removing a small blue jar from her bag and placing it on his desk. "This is Youth Dew. Not just a fragrance, but a statement. Women are buying it for themselves, not waiting for men to gift it to them. Times are changing, Mr. Jenkins. Women have their own money now, their own choices." Jenkins studied her for a long moment. 3 hours, near the entrance to the cosmetics hall, but I expect you to manage it yourself. I wouldn't have it any other way. By noon, a small crowd had gathered around the impromptu Estée counter. Estée's hands moved with practiced grace as she applied creams and demonstrated her touch technique on curious customers. She spoke quietly, intimately, as though sharing secrets with old friends. "The skin around your eyes is delicate, like fine silk," she told a woman in her 40s. "Pat gently, never rub. Beauty isn't about hiding who you are, it's about revealing your best self." Her New York pragmatism, delivered with European elegance, struck a chord with the London shoppers. They weren't accustomed to the founder of a beauty company applying products herself, explaining techniques, teaching rather than simply selling. Jenkins observed from a distance, notepad in hand. By 3 o'clock, when the demonstration concluded, the evidence was undeniable. Sales figures didn't lie. "I believe we have some paperwork to complete, Mrs. Lauder," he said, approaching her as she was carefully packing her samples. Harrod's would be pleased to offer Estée a permanent counter. That evening, in her suite at Claridge's, Estée made 2 calls. The first to her husband Joseph back in New York. "We've done it," she said, her voice quiet but triumphant. "Harrod's has signed. Europe is no longer just a dream." "I never doubted you for a moment," Joseph replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "The boys send their love. Leonard says the production line is ready whenever you give the word." After hanging up, she made her second call to her small but growing team in New York. "Prepare the international division files," she instructed. Next stops: Paris, Milan, and Zurich. The formula remains the same: personal demonstrations, trained beauty advisors, prestige locations only. As she gazed out at the London lights, Estée felt the weight of the signed Harrods contract in her hands. Europe had been considered unconquerable territory for American beauty brands. The old aristocracy of cosmetics, Helena Rubinstein among them, had maintained that European mystique was an impenetrable barrier. "Mystique can be created," Estée whispered to her reflection in the window. "And what I'm selling isn't just beauty, it's the American promise, possibility, renewal." By the spring of 1961, as America welcomed the Kennedy administration with its youth and glamour, Estée Lauder products had secured prime counter space at Harrods. The system that worked in New York was replicated precisely in London: impeccably dressed beauty advisors, all trained in the Lauder touch technique, generous samples, and the signature gift with purchase strategy that transformed customers into collectors. Back in New York, Estée studied reports from London while meeting with her growing team in their Madison Avenue offices. The space was modest compared to their competitors, but she preferred reinvesting in product development and international expansion rather than lavish headquarters. "Jacqueline Kennedy is defining a new aesthetic," Estée observed, noting a magazine cover featuring the First Lady. "Sophisticated but approachable. European-inspired but distinctly American. Our packaging and marketing should echo this sensibility." Leonard, her eldest son and the company's emerging operations leader, nodded. At 32, he had his mother's instinct for quality control, but his father's head for systems and scale. "The UK numbers are exceeding projections by 18%, he noted. "But we're seeing something interesting in the customer profiles. The average Harrods Lauder customer is 5 years younger than our American counterpart." "The war," Estée replied thoughtfully. "Europe lost a generation of young men. The women who survived came of age during rationing and rebuilding. Now they have jobs, discretionary income, and no interest in looking austere anymore. They want renewal, optimism, exactly what our products represent." By late 1962, as the world held its breath during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Estée found herself in Paris, negotiating counter space at Galeries Lafayette. The stakes felt higher here. The spiritual home of beauty, where French brands reigned supreme. The perfume hall buzzed with elegant Parisians sampling scents on paper strips, their conversations a gentle murmur beneath the grand dome of the century-old department store. Estée observed them carefully, noting how differently they interacted with beauty products compared to American or British women. "They're not embarrassed by their pursuit of beauty," she remarked to Evelyn, her most trusted beauty advisor who had traveled with her from New York. "In America, women almost apologize for wanting to look beautiful. Here, it's considered essential, like breathing." "Will we need to adjust our approach?" Evelyn asked. "No," Estée replied firmly. "We're not selling what they already have. We're offering something new. American efficiency with European quality, aspiration without intimidation." The Paris launch succeeded, but not without resistance. The French beauty press initially dismissed Estée as cosmétiques américaines, said with a slightly dismissive tone. Helena Rubinstein, who had built her empire with European aristocratic associations, made pointed remarks to beauty editors about newcomers and mass-market thinking. Estée absorbed these criticisms silently, responding only with meticulous attention to her counters and strategic appearances at influential Parisian salons. She understood that in France, beauty was not just commerce, it was culture. By 1963, as America reeled from the Kennedy assassination, Estée had secured footholds in London, Paris, Zurich, and was eyeing Milan and eventually Tokyo. The company's annual revenue approached $40 million, an extraordinary figure for a business still privately held and debt-free. That summer, Estée and Joseph purchased a townhouse on East 75th Street, just steps from Central Park. The 5-story brownstone represented more than just a home. It was positioning. The Upper East Side address placed them within walking distance of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and neighbors like the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts. "Is it too ostentatious?" Joseph asked as they toured the empty rooms, their footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Estée ran her hand along a marble mantelpiece. "It's exactly right. Not to impress, but to belong. The buyers from Sachs and Bergdorf's need to see us as equals, not suppliers. This address says we've arrived." Yet, even as her wealth grew, Estée maintained her relentless work ethic. She visited stores unannounced, often reapplying makeup for customers herself when she felt her beauty advisors weren't performing to standard. She wrote handwritten notes to counter managers across the country, sometimes 50 in a single evening. "Mrs. Lauder, surely you could delegate some of this correspondence," her assistant suggested one night as Estée sat at her desk in the 75th Street study, a stack of note cards before her. "The moment I stop touching the business is the moment we begin to fail," Estée replied without looking up. Helena Rubinstein sits in her office surrounded by art and antiques, sending memos. "I'm in the stores, touching faces, writing notes, training staff. That's why we're growing and she's maintaining." The rivalry between Estée and Helena Rubinstein had intensified as Lauder expanded internationally. Rubinstein, 25 years Lauder's senior, had built her empire on exclusivity and European heritage. Estée was building hers on American optimism and personal connection. In 1964, the competitive landscape shifted again when Estée launched Aramis, a men's fragrance line that would expand into a complete grooming collection. The decision represented a strategic evolution. Brand architecture was no longer a single line, but a portfolio of distinct identities. "Men won't purchase products with the Estée Lauder name," Leonard had argued during development. "They need their own identity, their own branding." "And women don't want their husbands smelling like them," Estée added practically. "Aramis needs to feel completely separate, masculine, substantial." The Aramis launch coincided with cultural shifts. James Bond films were creating a new masculine ideal, sophisticated, worldly, unapologetically well-groomed. The fragrance, with notes of leather, spice, and woods, captured this evolving definition of masculinity. By early 1965, with international expansion accelerating and the product portfolio diversifying, Estée's personal wealth had grown to approximately $10 million, largely illiquid and reinvested in the company. The Lauders remained private about financial matters, preferring to let their products speak for themselves. One spring evening, as cherry blossoms dusted Central Park with pale pink, Estée hosted a small dinner at her townhouse. The guests included buyers from major department stores, beauty editors, and a few carefully selected socialites whose influence extended beyond New York. The dining room glowed with candlelight, the table set with Limoges china and crystal from Baccarat. Fresh flowers, white roses and lilacs, filled silver bowls along the center of the table. The scent of youth dew lingered subtly in the air, not from bottles but from Estée herself. The next 5 years will transform the beauty industry completely, she told her guests as dessert was served. Women are demanding more science, more specificity, more honesty from their products. Are you concerned about the new FDA oversight discussions? Asked the beauty editor from Harper's Bazaar, referring to emerging conversations about ingredient regulation. On the contrary, Estée replied smoothly, standards benefit those who already maintain them. We've always formulated as if we were under scrutiny. Later that night, after the guests had departed, Estée stood in her dressing room, methodically removing her makeup with cleansing cream. Joseph appeared in the doorway, watching her familiar ritual. "You never mentioned our plans for Japan," he noted. "I thought that was the next big announcement." Estée smiled at him in the mirror. "Always keep something in reserve, especially when Helena's assistant was among the guests. Tokyo will be announced when the contracts are signed, not before." 5 years ago, we were celebrating our first $1 million year, Joseph said. Now we're planning world domination. Not domination, Estée corrected gently. Presence. There's a difference. Helena wants to rule beauty. I want Estée Lauder to become so essential to women that they can't imagine their lives without us. As she completed her skincare routine, the same one she taught to thousands of women at department store counters, Ultiation, Estée considered how far they had come from the kitchen table operation. The Harrods cold call had been a gamble that transformed everything, opening doors across Europe that American beauty brands had found firmly closed. Yet despite the growing wealth and international acclaim, she still inspected every counter, trained every beauty advisor, and maintained personal relationships with store buyers. Touch remained her most powerful tool, whether applying cream to a customer's face or holding the hand of a department store executive while negotiating terms. The following morning, she would fly to Chicago for store visits, then to Los Angeles, then back to London. Her schedule, maintained meticulously in a small leather notebook, allowed for no idle hours. While competitors delegated and retreated, she advanced and engaged. The moment you believe you've succeeded is the moment you begin to fail, she often told her sons. There is no arrival point in this business, only the constant pursuit of perfection. As she drifted toward sleep that night, Estée's mind was already mapping the next expansion, the next product innovation, the next counter to conquer. The American beauty revolution she had launched was still in its early chapters, and she intended to write every page herself. The frosted glass doors to Dr. Norman Orentreich's Park Avenue dermatology practice swung open as Estée entered, her slim frame cutting a regal silhouette against the late afternoon light. It was 1967, and outside, America was tearing itself apart. Vietnam casualties mounting daily, riots scorching urban neighborhoods, students occupying university buildings. But in this clinical sanctuary of white coats and antiseptic calm, Estée was engineering a different kind of revolution. "Carol's already waiting," the receptionist said, directing her to a private consultation room where Carol Phillips, Estée's most trusted marketing executive, sat reviewing notes. "He's running 15 minutes behind," Carol said, not looking up. Typical doctor. Estée removed her gloves deliberately, one finger at a time. At 59, she maintained the composed elegance that had become her trademark. Perfectly coiffed hair, impeccable makeup that somehow appeared effortless, a conservative Chanel suit in navy that whispered money rather than shouting it. 15 minutes is nothing, Estée replied, her queen's accent long ago polished away through decades of self-reinvention. We're about to solve a problem worth millions. The problem was generational. While the Estée brand had conquered department store cosmetic counters with its aspirational glamour, a new market was emerging. Younger women with different values, influenced by the counterculture yet still seeking beauty solutions. College-educated daughters of the middle class who viewed their mother's beauty rituals as frivolous artifice, but still struggled with their complexions. The door opened, and Dr. Ohrenreich entered, tall, authoritative, the dermatologist to Manhattan's elite. "Ladies," he said, taking a seat, "let's continue our discussion about this new concept." Over the next hour, the trio refined what would become Clinique, a revolutionary dermatologist, guided skincare system built on the principles of science rather than mystery. The products would be allergy-tested, fragrance-free, developed with dermatological expertise. The consultants would wear white lab coats, lending clinical authority to beauty advice. "We won't claim it's medicine," Estée said, studying the prototype packaging, sleek, green, modern, nothing like the ornate gold cases of her eponymous line. "But we'll communicate scientific credibility." "The three-step system is key," Carol added. "Cleanse, clarify, moisturize." Simple enough for anyone to follow, but systematic enough to feel like science. Dr. Ohrenreich nodded, and the skin typing questionnaire creates personalization while reinforcing dermatological principles. As darkness fell over Manhattan, they crafted not just products, but an entire philosophy that would transform beauty marketing, rational permission to pursue beauty in an era increasingly suspicious of empty glamour. The following year, 1968, Leonard Lauder stood beside his mother at the inaugural Clinique counter at Saks Fifth Avenue. At 45, he had his father's analytical mind and his mother's instinctive understanding of luxury retail. The counter gleamed with clinical precision, white surfaces, green accents, consultants in lab coats with clipboards, a complete absence of the perfumed glamour that defined the Estée Lauder brand. "They said we were crazy to launch a second brand," Leonard murmured, watching the first customers approach. "That we'd cannibalize our own sales." "They don't understand segmentation," Estée replied, her eyes missing nothing as she observed the interaction between consultant and customer. Different women, different needs, different promises. Outside Saks, the city reflected the national turmoil. Garbage strikes leaving refuse piled on sidewalks. Tensions high after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination that April, students at Columbia University occupying campus buildings. Yet here, in this temple of controlled luxury, Estée had created an alternative reality, one where systematic science promised order and improvement in a chaotic world. A young woman with problematic skin was consulting with a white-coated Clinique advisor who analyzed her skin type using the diagnostic questionnaire. "That's our future," Estée said, nodding toward the customer. college-educated, questioning everything her mother taught her about beauty, wanting something that feels rational, not frivolous. Leonard understood the strategy. While his father Joseph managed the finances with conservative precision, insisting on zero borrowing and cautious growth, funded entirely through retained earnings, Estée and Leonard focused on expansion. Clinique would open doors to younger consumers without diluting the prestige of the Estée Lauder brand. The counter staff need more training on skin typing, Estée said, her perfectionism showing. Watch how she's holding the consultation card. It should be more visible to the customer to reinforce the scientific process. Leonard nodded. His mother's attention to retail theater remained unmatched. Every detail of the customer experience was choreographed, from the consultant's white coat to the precise angle of product display. "We need to discuss the modeling situation," Leonard said one evening in 1970, as they reviewed advertising proofs in Estée's East 75th Street townhouse. The living room reflected her personal aesthetic. European antiques, impressionist paintings, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over silk upholstery. It was a far cry from her childhood home above her father's hardware store in Corona, Queens. "Which situation is that?" Estée asked, though she knew precisely what her son meant. "Our campaigns use no black models," Leonard said directly. "The NAACP is putting pressure on the entire industry, and we're lagging behind. Revlon already featured a black model last year." Estée frowned slightly, considering the business implications. The civil rights movement had transformed America's racial consciousness, but the beauty industry remained segregated in many ways, from advertising to counter-staffing to shade ranges. "We quietly integrated our sales staff in '64, she noted, referring to their decision to hire black beauty consultants at select department stores. "Without fanfare, without protest." "Advertising is more visible," Leonard pointed out, "and Clinique's three-step system works for all skin types. It's the natural place to start." Estée studied the layout before her, a Clinique advertisement featuring a fresh-faced young woman with porcelain skin and blonde hair. The marketing conveyed clinical authority rather than aspirational glamour, but the racial messaging remained unchanged. "Not yet," she decided. "The Heartland department stores aren't ready. We'll monitor the situation." Leonard disagreed but didn't press. His mother's instinct for the American consumer had built their empire, but on this issue, he believed she was behind the cultural curve. Unknown to Estée, he was already working with Carol Phillips to identify black models for future Clinique campaigns, the first of which would appear in 1973. The ballroom at the Fashion Institute of Technology hummed with conversation as students waited for Estée to deliver her address. It was 1968, and she had been invited as an industry icon to speak to the next generation of beauty professionals. Backstage, Estée reviewed her notes one final time. Public speaking never came naturally to her. She preferred intimate selling. The one-on-one connection with a customer that had been her strength since she began demonstrating skin creams at her uncle's salon decades earlier. But since the Time magazine profile in 1962 had labeled her a business genius with its "Sweet Smell of Success" headline, such invitations had become common. The dean introduced her to enthusiastic applause, and Estée approached the podium with practiced grace. "I never attended college," she began, her voice clear and confident despite her nervousness. "And I stand before you today to tell you that in the beauty industry, formal education is less important than passion, instinct, and an unwillingness to settle for second rate. The audience stirred. It was an unusual message at an educational institution, but Estée had never followed conventional wisdom. I built my company by understanding women, their desires, their insecurities, their dreams. I watched, I listened, I connected. No marketing textbook taught me to give free gifts with purchase. No business school professor advised me to personally demonstrate products. She continued with the story of her rise, carefully edited, of course. No mention of her divorce and remarriage to Joseph, the failed Rexall distribution deal, or the years of grinding persistence through the Depression. Instead, she presented a narrative of inevitable success driven by quality and determination. Never settle for second rate. Not in your products, not in your people, not in yourself, she concluded. In beauty, as in life, excellence is the only standard worth pursuing. The applause was thunderous, the students inspired. None recognized that within her motivational message lay a subtle reinforcement of her brand positioning: premium quality, uncompromising standards, aspirational yet attainable. In the executive boardroom of the Lauder headquarters, Joseph Lauder studied the quarterly financials with the focused attention he'd applied to the company's books for decades. At 70, he remained the conservative counterweight to his wife's expansive vision, insisting on financial discipline even as the company grew exponentially. Clinique is performing beyond projections, he noted as Estée entered, first-year numbers already exceeding expectations. Of course it is, she replied, setting down a stack of women's magazines. We identified an unmet need and filled it with unmatched quality. The multi-brand strategy is working exactly as Leonard and I predicted. Joseph nodded, though he had initially questioned the wisdom of launching what could be seen as a competing brand. His fiscal conservatism, zero borrowings, growth funded entirely through retained earnings, had provided the stable financial foundation that supported Estée's creative and marketing brilliance. Speaking of Leonard, Joseph said, he wants to accelerate international expansion. Ronald is pushing particularly hard on European distribution. Their younger son, Ronald, had been developing the international division, showing a diplomatic skill that would later serve him in politics. At 36, he complemented Leonard's operational focus with a global perspective. Europe is ready, Estée agreed. The American cachet still carries tremendous weight there. But Asia is the future. The Japanese consumer understands luxury at a profound level. She moved to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. At 54, she had built an empire that now included 3 distinct brands: Estée, Lauder, Aramis for men, and Clinique. Each targeted different demographics while sharing the same infrastructure, an efficient model that maximized return on investment. I've been thinking, she said carefully, about stepping back, not retiring, never retiring, but transitioning more operational responsibility to Leonard. Joseph looked up, surprised. Estée's identity was so thoroughly intertwined with the company that the notion of her stepping back seemed almost inconceivable. Are you certain? He asked. Not from everything, she clarified. I'll remain chairman. Marketing and product development will always be mine, but Leonard is ready for the presidency. He's earned it. What remained unspoken was her continued intention to audit counters personally, to rewrite advertising copy when needed, to ensure that quality control met her exacting standards. The transition would be more formal than substantive. a recognition of Leonard's capabilities rather than a true relinquishment of control. The laboratory at the Lauder Development Facility in Melville, Long Island, buzzed with scientific precision as Estée examined the latest Clinique formulations. White-coated chemists moved between workstations, measuring, mixing, testing, a far cry from her early days mixing creams in her kitchen. "The moisturizer texture still isn't right," she said, rubbing the sample between her fingers. "Too heavy for the younger customer. They want hydration without residue." The lead chemist nodded, making notes. 5 years had passed since Clinique's launch, and the brand had already become a powerhouse, on track to reach 100 million in sales by the end of the decade. The dermatologist-guided approach had resonated powerfully with consumers seeking rational beauty in an irrational world. A laboratory assistant approached with a telephone. "Mrs. Lauder, your son Leonard is on line 1. He says it's important." She took the call, listening intently. "I understand," she said finally. "Yes, tomorrow morning is fine." Hanging up, she turned to the chemist. "Reformulate with a higher percentage of the humectant and less oil. I need samples by next week." Her mind had already shifted to Leonard's news. After months of deliberation, she had made her decision. In 1973, at 65, Estée would officially name Leonard president of Estée Lauder Companies while retaining her position as chairman. The board meeting was brief and ceremonial. The company remained privately held, controlled entirely by the Lauder family, making the transition a family decision rather than a corporate one. "It gives me great pleasure," Estée announced to the gathered executives, "to name Leonard Lauder as president of Estée Lauder Companies, effective immediately." Applause filled the room as Leonard, now 50, accepted the position with characteristic grace. Joseph beamed with paternal pride while Ronald offered congratulations to his older brother. "This transition recognizes the extraordinary contributions Leonard has made to our growth," Estée continued. "His operational expertise and strategic vision have been instrumental in our expansion, particularly with the success of Clinique and our international development." What went unmentioned was the careful balance of power that would continue. Leonard would oversee daily operations and corporate strategy, but Estée would maintain final authority over product development, marketing aesthetics, and quality control, the elements she considered most critical to the brand's identity. After the meeting, mother and son stood alone in her office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. "This changes nothing essential," she said quietly. "I'll be at counters every week. I'll still approve every advertisement, every package design, every formula change." Leonard smiled. "I wouldn't have it any other way." "The company needs your management skills now," she continued, "your systems, your organization. But it will always need my eye, my touch." "Your magic," Leonard added. She dismissed the sentiment with a wave. Not magic, work, attention, standards. As the afternoon light cast long shadows across the office, Estée contemplated the empire she had built from nothing, a global corporation approaching annual revenues of $300 million. A household name synonymous with prestige beauty, a family legacy secured for generations. The America outside her window was transforming, emerging from Vietnam, reeling from Watergate, grappling with profound social change. But within the world she had created, certain principles remained immutable: uncompromising quality, scientific innovation, aspirational marketing, and family control. While she might delegate the presidency, Her vision would continue to guide the company that bore her name. The semi-retirement announcement made headlines in the business press, but those who knew Estée understood the truth. She would never truly step away from the company that was her life's work, her passion, and her enduring legacy. The scent of despair clung to Manhattan like stale perfume in the winter of 1974. Outside Estée's office window on Fifth Avenue, New York City struggled through its darkest hour. Garbage piled on sidewalks, newspapers screaming about oil embargoes, and lines at gas stations stretching for blocks. But it was the financial pages that truly haunted Estée as she stood at the window, her slender silhouette framed against the gray January sky. $200 million in revenue, she whispered to herself, and profits down to 5%. The numbers felt like a betrayal after decades of growth. Just 4 years earlier, they had finally surpassed Helena Rubinstein, her longtime rival. Now everything seemed to be crumbling. Joseph Lauder's reflection appeared beside hers in the glass. At 72, her husband still maintained the posture of the accountant he had always been, conservative and precise, his eyes carrying the weight of their shared concerns. "Estée, we need to discuss the Revlon offer," he said quietly. "Charles Revson is offering $150 million. That's more money than either of us could spend in several lifetimes." She turned, her gaze sharp despite her 65 years. "You want to sell our company, everything we've built?" "I want us to consider reality," Joseph replied, his voice gentle but firm. "The recession isn't ending tomorrow. The oil crisis has people choosing between gasoline and lipstick. And now the FDA with their new labeling requirements." He sighed, adjusting his glasses. "We need to be practical." Estée moved to her desk, running her fingers across the sample jars of Clinique's latest formulation. The brand they had launched 6 years earlier had been brilliantly timed: transparent ingredients, dermatologist backing, a clean aesthetic that felt honest in a world growing increasingly skeptical of corporate claims. "Leonard and Ronald should be part of this conversation," she said, referring to their son and son-in-law who had become integral to the company's operations. "They're waiting in the conference room," Joseph confirmed, "with the financial reports." The ensuing meeting would later be known within the company as the Joseph Argument, a watershed moment that nearly altered the fate of the Lauder empire. Leonard Lauder, at 41, had already proven himself a marketing genius. He sat beside Ronald Perelman, both men in tailored suits that couldn't disguise their tension. "Mother," Leonard began, "the numbers don't lie. Last quarter was our worst in company history. Department stores are cutting orders. The luxury market is contracting." Estée listened as they laid out the brutal facts: inflation at 12% and climbing, unemployment rising, and their profit margins slipping month by month. The elegant conference room with its blue silk wallpaper, her signature color, now felt like a war room. "Revlon's offer is serious," Joseph added. "Charles won't wait forever." Revlon, Estée repeated the name like a curse. The company had been their chief rival for years, fighting for counter space and consumer loyalty. "And what happens to our products under Revson?" "Our counter staff, our standards." "We'd negotiate guarantees," Ronald suggested. "Guarantees on paper," she said dismissively. "You think Charles Revson cares about training our beauty advisors to apply foundation properly?" You think he'll maintain our sampling program when his accountants tell him it's too expensive. Joseph leaned forward. Estée, be reasonable. We're talking about financial security for generations. We started this company from nothing, from your uncle's chemistry formulas and kitchen experiments. We've succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. Maybe it's time to acknowledge that. Her blue eyes flashed. Succeed? You think I measure success by a bank account? This company is not just a business. It's my life's work. It's our legacy. A legacy that might not survive this recession, Leonard cautioned. Estée stood abruptly. I need time to think. Without another word, she left the conference room, the heels of her shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. For the next 3 days, Estée effectively disappeared. She canceled appointments, locked herself in her Park Avenue apartment, and refused calls, even from Joseph and her sons. Those who knew her best recognized the pattern. She was regrouping, strategizing in isolation. The city outside continued its descent into economic malaise. President Ford's administration seemed paralyzed by the combination of stagnant growth and soaring inflation, the dreaded stagflation that defied conventional economic wisdom. New York itself teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, its services crumbling, its once proud avenues dimmed by fear and neglect. On the 4th day, Estée's driver delivered a handwritten note to each executive. Meeting. My office. 9 a.m. They found her transformed, not defeated but renewed, her makeup impeccable, her navy suit pressed, her pearls gleaming in the morning light. The conference table was covered with product samples, market research, and strategic plans sketched in her distinctive handwriting. We're not selling, she announced without preamble. Not now, not ever. Joseph sighed. Estée. No, she interrupted firmly. I've made my decision. This company stays in our family. Leonard studied the materials on the table. You have a plan. We're going to double down on Clinique, she said, tapping a folder. Transparent ingredients, scientific approach. In times of uncertainty, consumers want trust, not fantasy. The FDA's new labeling requirements. We'll make them an advantage. While our competitors scramble to comply, we'll advertise our full disclosure as a virtue. She moved to another set of documents. And we're launching a new brand, Prescriptives, custom blended foundations matched to exact skin tones, prescribed for individual needs. No more one shade fits all. Ronald looked skeptical. New product development in this economy? Innovation doesn't wait for prosperity, Estée countered. The recession won't last forever, but the customers who find us during hard times will remember who served them well. Our counter staff will be our salvation. They're the front line of our relationship with every woman who approaches them. For 2 hours, she outlined her vision, not just survival tactics, but growth strategies. She had calculated every detail, from production costs to training programs, from advertising budgets to counter-placement negotiations with department stores. Joseph watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. This is risky, he said finally, if it fails. Then we'll have failed on our terms, she replied, not Charles Revson's. The decision was made. Revlon's offer was politely declined. In the months that followed, Estée drove herself and her team relentlessly. working 16-hour days despite her age, personally visiting counters to ensure standards were maintained, even as competitors cut corners to save costs. The remainder of 1974 was brutal. Revenue continued to stagnate, and profits shrank further. Department stores struggled to stay afloat. Some closed altogether, taking valuable counter space with them. The stock market tumbled, with the Dow Jones dipping below 600 points, a psychological barrier that seemed to confirm America's decline. By the spring of 1975, New York City's financial crisis had reached its nadir. The infamous Daily News headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead," captured the federal government's refusal to bail out the metropolis. The city that had nurtured Estée from an immigrant's daughter to a cosmetics queen was on life support. Yet within the company, a quiet transformation was taking place. Clinique's clean, clinical approach began resonating with consumers wary of extravagance. The brand's three-step system, cleanse, exfoliate, moisturize, offered a routine, a sense of control in chaotic times. The transparent ingredient listings, once seen as a regulatory burden, became a selling point. The development of prescriptives continued behind closed doors, with Estée personally testing formulations and training methodologies. It was expensive and complex, requiring specialized equipment and staff training, but she remained convinced of its potential. "Women don't stop wanting to look beautiful in a recession," she told her skeptical finance team. "They just become more discerning about where they spend. We need to be worth every dollar." By late 1976, the first signs of recovery appeared. Counter sales began to climb. Reorders increased. The holiday season exceeded modest projections. Estée, never one to celebrate prematurely, allowed herself a moment of vindication during the year-end executive meeting. "We're still standing," she noted simply, "and we're still family-owned." Joseph nodded, acknowledging her vision without words. Their partnership had weathered this crisis as it had others, his caution balancing her boldness, her instincts complementing his precision. The late 70s brought gradual improvement. America's economic malaise continued under President Carter, but the cosmetics industry began to stabilize. Estée, having maintained its premium positioning and counter-discipline through the worst years, was positioned to capitalize on even modest consumer confidence. Prescriptives formally launched, offering custom-blended foundations that addressed individual skin tones and concerns. It was a logistical challenge. Each counter required specialized equipment and extensively trained consultants. But it reinforced the company's commitment to personalized beauty at a time when mass production dominated the industry. By 1980, as Ronald Reagan campaigned on a promise to restore America's confidence, Estée's annual revenue had climbed back above $400 million, with healthier profit margins restored. The company had not only survived, but emerged stronger, its commitment to quality and service intact when many competitors had compromised. The near-death experience of 1974 became part of company mythology, the moment when selling out would have been the easy choice, when the family's resolve was tested and ultimately strengthened. In later years, when discussing the company's unique governance structure and resistance to public offerings, executives would point to this period as formative. "We decided then that family control was non-negotiable," Leonard would explain to interested parties. "It allows us to make decisions for the long term, not the next quarterly report." For Estée and Joseph, however, the victory carried a personal cost. The stress of those years, the relentless work pace, the constant travel to shore up international markets, all took their toll, particularly on Joseph, who had passed 75 and still maintained a full work schedule. One evening in 1981, as they sat in their Fifth Avenue apartment overlooking Central Park, Joseph set aside the financial reports he'd been reviewing and removed his glasses. "Estée," he said quietly, "I'm tired." She looked up from her own work, counter-performance evaluations from the Midwest region, and really saw him for the first time in months. The strain around his eyes, the deeper lines at his mouth, the slight tremor in his hands that she'd been too busy to notice. "Perhaps we should take a vacation," she suggested. "The south of France in spring. Remember how we loved Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat?" He shook his head gently. "I don't mean that kind of tired." The implication hung between them, not a complaint, but a reality that neither could ignore much longer. Joseph had been her partner in every sense, the financial architect behind her creative vision, the steady hand that had guided their enterprise through depression, war, and recession. "I'll cut back on my travel," she promised, setting aside her papers. "Leonard can handle the European divisions. Ronald is more than capable of managing domestic operations." Joseph smiled. "You won't cut back. You've never been able to delegate what matters to you, and everything matters to you, Estée." There was no accusation in his tone, only understanding. They had built this life together, chosen its priorities, accepted its sacrifices. The company that bore her name was as much his creation as hers, though he had always remained in the background, content to let her be the face and voice of their shared vision. In 1983, Joseph Lauder died of heart-related complications. Estée, 75 herself, but still actively involved in every aspect of the company, stood at his funeral surrounded by family, employees, and industry figures who had come to pay respects to the quiet half of one of beauty's most successful partnerships. Months later, in a rare interview that touched on personal matters, she made a statement that revealed more than her usual careful public comments. "I stole 9 years from him," she admitted. 9 years when he should have been relaxing, enjoying our success. Instead, he was still working, still supporting my ambitions. The admission was striking from a woman who rarely acknowledged regret or weakness. Those who knew them recognized the truth, that Joseph had never begrudged her the years, that he had found purpose in their shared enterprise until the end. But her words reflected a reckoning with the costs of empire building, the personal sacrifices behind the glamorous facade. By the time of Joseph's death, Estée Lauder Inc. had fully recovered from the recession years. Annual revenue exceeded $600 million, with a diverse portfolio of brands and international distribution that spanned major markets worldwide. The crisis that had nearly led to selling the company had instead cemented its most fundamental principle, that family ownership was the cornerstone of its identity and strategy. Leonard Lauder stepped fully into leadership alongside his brother Ronald, but Estée remained the final authority on product development, counter-presentation, and brand standards. Without Joseph's moderating influence, she became more demanding, more exacting in her expectations, as if maintaining perfect standards could somehow fill the void left by his absence. On a cold December evening in 1983, she visited the Bloomingdale's flagship store on Lexington Avenue, inspecting the counter display for the holiday collection. The beauty advisor, recognizing her immediately despite the lack of announcement, straightened her posture and summoned her most professional smile. "Mrs. Lauder, what an honor." Estée nodded briskly, her gaze already scanning the counter for imperfections. "Show me how you're presenting the new gift sets." For the next hour, she observed, corrected, demonstrated the proper way to apply foundation, the precise angle for displaying fragrance bottles, the exact phrasing to use when describing skin benefits. The young woman absorbed every word, recognizing the rare opportunity to learn from the founder herself. As Estée prepared to leave, satisfied that standards were being maintained, she paused. "How long have you worked for us?" 3 years, Mrs. Lauder. I started during the recession, when jobs were scarce." "And why did you stay?" The beauty advisor considered the question carefully. "Because even when times were tough, the company never compromised. We still gave samples, still took time with each customer. It felt like we were offering something real when everything else seemed uncertain." Estée nodded, a small smile softening her expression. "Remember that. It's why we survived when others didn't. It's why we'll outlast whatever comes next." She stepped back into the December chill, the lights of the city glittering against the early darkness. The crisis years had changed her, hardened some edges, deepened her conviction that control was the only guarantee of quality. Joseph's death had left her more isolated in some ways, more dependent on the company as her center of gravity. But the essential truth remained. She had refused to sell when selling seemed the only rational choice. She had insisted that family ownership was worth more than immediate security. And in doing so, she had established the principle that would guide the company long after she was gone, that the Lauder name on the package was not just a brand but a promise, one that could never be negotiated away. The recession, regulation, and near death of the mid-70s had tested that promise to its limits. In surviving, Estée had defined itself not just as a cosmetics company, but as a family legacy, expensive to maintain, exhausting to protect, but ultimately beyond price. The soft glow of Manhattan's skyline filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Lauder penthouse on Fifth Avenue, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Estée stood by the window, her petite frame silhouetted against the city lights, a glass of chilled Perrier in her hand. Outside, Reagan's America hummed with prosperity, but inside this carefully curated sanctuary, the matriarch of beauty contemplated control. "Leonard will be here any minute," she said to her assistant, adjusting a perfectly placed orchid in a crystal vase. At 78, Estée moved with the precision of someone half her age, her scrutinizing eyes missing nothing. The elevator chimed, and Leonard Lauder entered, carrying a leather portfolio. At 51, he bore the confident posture of a man who had spent the past decade expanding an empire. The Japanese market numbers were impressive, a 30% growth in the past year alone. Behind Leonard stood Ronald, freshly returned from diplomatic meetings in Washington. The brothers nodded respectfully to their mother, a ritual unchanged since childhood. "The Asia strategy is working beyond projections," Leonard said, spreading charts across the antique table. "We've doubled counter space in Tokyo's Ginza district." Estée touched the paper lightly, almost caressing the numbers. "And how do the counters look? Are they perfect? Are the girls demonstrating properly?" "I visited personally," Leonard assured her. "Every counter is immaculate." Ronald loosened his tie. The State Department connections are opening doors. Reagan's appointments team called again today. Estée's eyes narrowed slightly. Politics and business. A dangerous combination, Ronald. Strategic, he corrected. Ambassador to Austria would position us perfectly for European expansion. The room fell silent. Vienna. The city she had claimed as her ancestral home for decades. The fabrication had served its purpose. Queens-born Josephine Esther Menser had become Estée of aristocratic Viennese heritage. The lie wasn't malicious, it was strategic. In the beauty industry, narrative was as important as formula. Just remember where your first obligations lie, she finally said. The company comes before politics. Leonard, ever the diplomat between mother and brother, redirected. The prescriptives line is struggling with the custom blending technology. The operations cost is. I never believed in that concept, Estée interrupted. Beauty isn't manufactured by machines. It's created by touch, by demonstration. She walked to her vanity, where bottles of beautiful, her newest fragrance success, stood in perfect alignment. This is what sells. Romance. Promise, not technology. Sunday morning at Temple Imanu, L was as much ritual as religion for Estée. The German Jewish elite of New York's Upper East Side nodded respectfully as she took her regular seat. Her hair perfectly coiffed, her Chanel suit impeccable. Rabbi Posner's sermon touched on wealth and responsibility, themes that resonated throughout the soaring sanctuary on Fifth Avenue and 65th Street. After services, Ira Milstein, the corporate governance attorney who had become an increasingly important advisor, joined her for coffee at her apartment. The board structure we've been discussing, Milstein began carefully, spreading papers across the table. As the company grows, outside directors would provide valuable. This is a family business, Ira, she interrupted, stirring a silver spoon in her demi-tasse cup. Always has been, always will be. Milstein, accustomed to her resistance, tried another angle. When you eventually consider going public. We don't need public money, she said firmly. Joseph taught me that. No debt, no outside control. The attorney nodded, respecting the invocation of her late husband. Nevertheless, preparing governance structures now would position the company for whatever the family decides in the future. Estée gazed out the window at Central Park, trees swaying in the autumn breeze. Prepare what you think is necessary, but remember, this company bears my name, not shareholders, not bankers, mine. Leonard Lauder's office at 767 Fifth Avenue embodied Reagan-era corporate aesthetics, understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted. His Bloomberg terminal displayed market data, while his desk held photographs of his wife Evelyn and their sons William and Gary. The Wall Street Journal lay open, a small article circled in red. The intercom buzzed. Your mother is here. Estée entered like a general inspecting troops, her eyes taking inventory of every detail. You've seen the article? Leonard asked. She nodded. The piece questioned whether family control at Estée companies stifled innovation. The word nepotism appeared twice. The journal reaches influential people, Leonard said. We should consider a response. Estée settled into a chair. Since when do we explain ourselves to journalists? The market is changing, Mother. Transparency is becoming expected. She considered this, tapping perfectly manicured nails against the armrest. What would you say to them? Leonard had anticipated the question. That family ownership ensures long-term thinking. That we're not slaves to quarterly earnings like public companies. That our values, quality, service, innovation remain consistent because we answer to ourselves, not Wall Street. Then say it, she replied. But don't apologize for success or for family. Never apologize for either. The protests outside Estée Lauder's Fifth Avenue headquarters had grown more organized by 1988. Young activists with PETA signs displayed disturbing images of rabbits in testing labs. "Beauty shouldn't hurt," read one sign. "Stop animal testing now," demanded another. From her limousine, Estée watched the demonstrators with a mixture of irritation and calculation. "Drive around the block," she instructed her chauffeur. "I'll use the private entrance." Inside, the executive committee awaited in the boardroom. Leonard began without preamble. "The animal testing situation is becoming untenable," he said. "Consumer sentiment is shifting. Several European markets are considering bans." Ronald, recently returned from his ambassadorship in Austria, added, "The political winds are shifting too. Regulation is coming, whether we lead or follow." Estée listened, her face betraying nothing. For decades, testing on animals had been standard industry practice required in some countries, a liability shield in others. But the landscape was changing. "What do our scientists say?" she asked. The head of research cleared his throat. "We've been developing alternative testing methods. They're not yet comprehensive, but within a year, we could potentially eliminate most animal testing." Estée nodded slowly. "Then we announce a moratorium, not because of protesters, but because we've found a better way. We lead, we don't follow." Leonard smiled slightly. His mother's instinct for converting necessity into virtue remained impeccable. By 1989, Estée Lauder would announce its ban on animal testing, framed as ethical leadership rather than capitulation to protest. The Lauder family's private art gallery occupied the top floor of their Manhattan headquarters, a sanctuary few were privileged to enter. Impressionist masterpieces lined the walls: Monet, Renoir, Degas. Estée stood before a particularly luminous Modigliani, studying the elongated face of the subject. "Beautiful addition," noted Leonard, joining his mother. "Beauty is our business," she replied, "in all its forms." Their art collection had grown substantially in recent years, a diversification strategy as the company matured. For decades, nearly 90% of the family's wealth had remained invested in Estée Lauder companies. Now, with the business stable and expanding globally, they had gradually shifted portions of their fortune into real estate and fine art. "The Picasso auction is next week," Leonard mentioned, "the one you admired at the Guggenheim retrospective." Estée nodded. "Make the arrangements. But be discreet. I don't want the papers saying I'm spending while our employees worry about their jobs." This was the essence of Estée's wealth philosophy: strategic acquisition but minimal ostentation. Her Palm Beach estate and Manhattan townhouse were substantial but not flashy by billionaire standards. The art was her one visible indulgence, and even then she described it as buying beauty, not investment, though it functioned effectively as both. The portfolio advisors sent their quarterly recommendations, Leonard continued. They suggest more international exposure, perhaps some technology stocks. She dismissed this with a wave. "I know beauty, I know real estate, I know art. I don't know computers or foreign factories. We stick with what we understand." Leonard didn't push. His mother's conservative investment approach, heavily concentrated in their own business, had built a fortune estimated above $200 million. Who could argue with success? The counter at Saks Fifth Avenue gleamed under precisely calibrated lighting. Estée, now in her 80s but still razor-sharp, adjusted a display of beautiful perfume bottles by millimeters. The sales associates watched nervously, aware of her legendary attention to detail. "Show me how you demonstrate youth do," she commanded a young saleswoman. The associate began her presentation, but Estée stopped her after 30 seconds. "No, no. You're selling like it's a commodity. Watch." She took the bottle, approached a passing customer, and transformed. The commanding CEO vanished, replaced by an elegant saleswoman with hypnotic charm. "May I show you something wonderful?" she asked the startled woman. "Just the lightest touch here," she demonstrated on the customer's wrist, "and you carry a secret with you all day. Only those you allow close will discover it." The customer, mesmerized by this personal attention from the founder herself, purchased not only Youth Dew but also 3 additional products. When the customer left, Estée turned to the associates. "That is how it's done. Every woman wants to feel special, to feel discovered. You're not selling perfume, you're selling confidence, allure, possibility." The counter manager later confided to a colleague, 80-something years old, worth hundreds of millions, and she still sells like her next meal depends on it. The family gathered at Estée's Palm Beach estate for Thanksgiving 1990. Beyond the windows, palm trees swayed against an impossibly blue sky, a stark contrast to New York's November chill. Leonard and Evelyn, Ronald and Joe Carroll, and their children represented the culmination of Estée's life work, a dynasty built from jars of cream. "William tells me he's interested in the business," Leonard mentioned as they sipped aperitifs on the terrace. Estée studied her grandson thoughtfully. At 29, William had his father's analytical mind and something of her own marketing instinct. "Is he starting at the counter?" she asked. Leonard smiled. "Of course, everyone does." This was Lauder Doctrine family members received no special treatment at entry level. They worked counters, learned the products, experienced rejection, and earned their advancement. Dynasty wasn't hereditary at Estée, it was earned through performance. Later, as the family dined on turkey with all the trimmings, Ronald raised his glass. "To Mother, who taught us persistence before prosperity." Estée acknowledged the toast with a nod, but her mind was elsewhere. The Gulf War loomed, recession threatened, and the beauty industry faced new challenges from upstarts and conglomerates alike. At the head of her table, surrounded by the fruits of her labor, she was already calculating next steps, new markets, fresh approaches. Leonard recognized the look. "What are you planning, Mother?" She smiled slightly. "There are still countries where Estée isn't the finest name in beauty. That situation requires correction." The family laughed, but they knew better than to dismiss her determination. In her 9th decade, Estée remained hungry, not for more personal wealth, but for the expansion of her vision, her legacy, her name on counters from Moscow to Beijing. As 1991 drew to a close, Estée sat in her office reviewing the year's results. Global revenue had surpassed $1.5 billion. The company operated in 70 countries. Thousands of employees worldwide represented her standards, her products, her name. A soft knock at the door preceded Leonard's entrance. "The succession papers are ready for your review," he said, placing a leather folder before her. Inside lay the documents that would formalize what was already operational reality. Leonard as chief executive, Ronald managing international strategy and his political endeavors, a trust structure preserving family control while allowing for eventual public participation. Estée turned the pages slowly, not reading the legal language but contemplating the transition they represented. She had built something remarkable from nothing, from kitchen table to global empire, from immigrant dreams to international prestige. "Will you sign today?" Leonard asked gently. She closed the folder. "Tomorrow. Some decisions deserve a night's reflection." After Leonard left, Estée stood at her window watching Manhattan's lights. The city that had transformed Josephine Esther Menser into Estée now lay at her feet. In the reflection of the glass, she caught a glimpse of herself, elegant, poised, impeccably presented. The image she had crafted as carefully as any product formula. The counter was where it had started, the sacred space where beauty was not merely sold, but performed, promised, delivered. Now her counters stood in the finest stores worldwide, her products in the most exclusive vanities, her name synonymous with aspiration. She smiled slightly at her reflection. Tomorrow, she would sign the papers that acknowledged the inevitable passage of time and authority. But tonight, she was still Estée Lauder, countergirl turned queen of beauty, architect of desire, empress of elegance. The city lights sparkled like diamonds below, and somewhere in the vastness of Manhattan, a young woman stood before a mirror, applying Estée Lauder lipstick, believing in the transformation it promised. That belief, that moment of hope and possibility, was Estée's true legacy, more lasting than contracts or succession plans or even her carefully curated name. It would endure as long as women gazed into mirrors and dreamed of becoming more beautiful versions of themselves, which, Estée knew with absolute certainty, would be forever. The snow fell across Manhattan in slow, deliberate flakes, backlit by the amber glow of office towers still burning their midnight oil. Through the window of her Upper East Side apartment, Estée watched this quiet performance with a contemplative gaze. At 84, she had witnessed countless New York winters, yet tonight the familiar scene seemed to carry new weight. Perhaps it was the recent news that had settled in her household like a shadow, unwelcome but impossible to ignore. Her daughter-in-law Evelyn's breast cancer diagnosis had arrived with the clinical precision of a bullet. The family had maintained composure in public, of course. The Lauders always did. But in private, the diagnosis had created ripples that moved through their lives with increasing urgency. "Mother," Leonard's voice pulled her from her thoughts as he entered the sitting room, manila folder in hand. "I've been thinking about what Evelyn proposed." Estée turned from the window, her silk robe catching the light from the crystal lamp beside her. Leonard nodded, settling into the leather chair across from her. At 65, her son had long ago taken operational control of the company that bore her name, but he never made decisions of consequence without consulting her first. The company might have grown beyond her daily management, but never beyond her influence. Self Magazine wants to partner with us. Pink ribbons distributed at every counter. 10 million in marketing support. Leonard opened the folder, but Estée waved it away. She didn't need to see the numbers. "What does Evelyn say?" she asked. "That it's bigger than us. That we have the platform." He paused. "That it would mean something." Estée crossed the room to a small Louis XIV writing desk and opened the top drawer, removing a slim, leather-bound notebook. For decades, she had recorded her observations about women, what they wanted, what they feared, what they would pay for. The notebook contained her accumulated wisdom on beauty, but more fundamentally, on human nature. "All these years," she said, "we've sold them hope in a jar. Perhaps now we sell them something else." "What's that?" Leonard asked. "Solidarity," Estée replied, returning to her seat. "We'll need 1.5 million ribbons by next quarter." "That many?" Leonard's eyebrows raised slightly. "If we're going to do this, we do it properly." Her tone was gentle but unyielding. "This isn't a promotion, Leonard. It's a movement." 6 months later, in the summer of 1992, Estée studied the pink ribbon pinned to the lapel of her Chanel suit as her driver navigated the midtown traffic. The ribbon campaign had exceeded even her expectations. Department store counters across America now featured Lauder beauty advisors wearing the pink symbol, and customers had begun requesting them, wearing them, talking about them. Breast cancer, long whispered about in hushed tones, was becoming something women could discuss openly. The car pulled up outside the gleaming skyscraper that housed their corporate offices. Inside, she found Evelyn in the conference room, surrounded by marketing materials, her energy seemingly undiminished by her ongoing treatments. "The doctors say I'm responding well," Evelyn said, embracing her mother-in-law. "And the campaign is too. Look at these numbers." Estée scanned the report. Awareness metrics were strong, but something was missing. "This is awareness," she said. "What about action?" Evelyn tilted her head questioningly. "Research," Estée clarified. "We need to fund the science, not just the conversation. A foundation, perhaps." "I've been thinking the same thing," Evelyn admitted, "but it would require significant investment." "Money," Estée said with a dismissive wave, "is just a tool. We have it, we use it." She looked out at the Manhattan skyline, the Empire State Building standing like an exclamation point against the summer sky. "I didn't build this company by thinking small, dear." Thus began the conversations that would lead to the Breast Cancer Research Foundation. Formally established in 1993, Evelyn would become its public face. But everyone in the organization understood that Estée's backing, financial and moral, was its foundation. The Shanghai air was thick with possibility when Estée stepped from the car into the humid embrace of the Chinese summer in 1993. At 85, she had insisted on making this trip despite her doctor's concerns. Some opportunities, she believed, demanded personal witness. "Look at their faces," she murmured to Leonard as they toured a local department store. Young Chinese women clustered around a beauty counter, testing creams and powders with expressions of careful delight. "They're just like the women at Saks in 1948, hungry for transformation." Leonard nodded, making notes. "The government's economic reforms are changing everything. The middle class is growing exponentially." "China will be our biggest market someday," Estée said with quiet certainty. "Not tomorrow, but it will come." Later, in their hotel suite overlooking the Bund, with its colonial architecture juxtaposed against the emerging skyline of Pudong across the river, she elaborated. "Beauty is universal, but aspiration is the real currency," she said, removing her pearl earrings as she prepared for dinner. "These women are climbing a ladder, just like the immigrants in Queens when I was a girl. They want markers of their progress." We're already opening discussions about local production facilities, Leonard began. No, Estée interrupted gently. Keep manufacturing in America and Europe for now. What they want from us is the prestige, the foreign cachet. If they believe it came from a Shanghai factory, the magic diminishes. Leonard smiled. After all these years, you still understand consumers better than our entire research department. Because I never stopped being one, she replied. I still want what they want, to be seen, to feel confident, to belong to something beautiful. The offices of Milstein & Co. on Park Avenue represented a different kind of power than Estée was accustomed to wielding. Legal power, financial power. The power of governance structures and shareholder rights. As she sat across from Ira Milstein in 1994, she felt the weight of the decision before them. A public offering makes sense now, Milstein explained, his tone measured and precise. The company needs growth capital, and your family needs liquidity for estate planning. Leonard added, our competitors are scaling up through public markets. We risk falling behind if we remain privately held. Estée studied them both. And what happens to our soul when quarterly reports become our master? That's precisely why we've structured this carefully, Milstein said, sliding a document across the polished conference table. Dual-class shares. Your family retains approximately 70% voting control, even if you own a minority of the economic equity. Explain it simply, Estée requested. Leonard leaned forward. We sell Class A shares to the public, 1 vote per share. Our family keeps Class B shares, 10 votes per share. We maintain control of the board, of major decisions. Wall Street gets the growth story they want, but they can't force us to compromise on quality or chase short-term profits. Estée removed her reading glasses and placed them carefully beside the document. And this has worked for other families? The Salzburgers at the New York Times, the Newhouses at Condé Nast, Milstein confirmed. It's a well-established structure for preserving family influence while accessing public capital. For several moments, Estée was silent, considering. The company she had built from kitchen table experiments had grown beyond anything she could have imagined in those early days. Going public felt like releasing something precious into the wild. If we do this, she finally said, I want one promise from both of you. The company's name is also mine. It carries my values. Never let the market separate the two. MAC Cosmetics, Leonard announced, placing the portfolio on the glass coffee table in Estée's library. Toronto-based, founded by Frank Toscan and Frank Angelo in 1984. They're artists first, business people second. Estée lifted the lookbook, studying the bold colors and unconventional models. Not our usual aesthetic, she observed. That's precisely the point, Leonard replied. They've captured the professional makeup artist community. They're the favorite of drag performers, theater productions, fashion shoots. Their stores are more like studios than beauty counters. And you want to acquire them? Estée asked, turning pages slowly. How much? 38 million. Estée raised an eyebrow. Significant. What's their revenue? Under 100 million now, but growing fast. Their margins are exceptional. She set down the portfolio. What happens to the founders? They stay, Leonard assured her. That's non-negotiable from our side, not just theirs. We need their creativity, their authenticity. Estée nodded slowly. I like that they don't pretend to be something they're not. No false promises, just artistic expression. She paused, considering. You know what I've always believed about acquisitions? Buy the artist, not the factory, Leonard quoted her favorite axiom. Exactly. The machines, the formulas, those can be replicated. But vision? That's irreplaceable. She handed the portfolio back to him. Make the deal. The New York Stock Exchange gleamed under the crisp autumn sunshine on the morning of November 17, 1995. Estée Lauder companies would begin trading under the symbol EL, and the family had gathered at the exchange for the ceremonial bell ringing. Estée, dressed in a powder blue suit that complemented her silver hair, stood surrounded by 3 generations of Lauders. At 87, she had lived to see her kitchen table enterprise transformed into a public corporation valued at billions. The journey from immigrant neighborhood to Wall Street was complete. As cameras flashed and traders prepared for the opening, Leonard leaned close to his mother. "Nervous?" he asked quietly. "Not at all," she replied, though she clutched her handbag a bit tighter than usual. "This is just another counter, Leonard, another place to tell our story." When the bell rang, applause erupted across the trading floor. Initial shares, priced at 26 each, began climbing immediately. By day's end, they would close nearly 40% higher, validating the market's appetite for the Lauder brand. Later, in the limousine returning uptown, Estée watched the city pass by, its energy seemingly amplified by her company's successful debut. "We raised $300 million today," Leonard said, reviewing the preliminary reports. "And the family still controls the voting rights." "And Bobby Brown?" Estée asked, referring to their most recent acquisition. "Closed last month. $74.5 million. Another artist with a clear vision." Estée nodded approvingly. First Mac, now Bobby, each with their own voice, their own customer. She smiled slightly. "I was right all those years ago, wasn't I, about fragmentation?" "About most things," Leonard acknowledged. As the car turned onto Fifth Avenue, Estée caught sight of Saks, where she had once handed out samples and performed demonstrations, desperate for the attention of customers and buyers alike. Now her company's counters occupied prime real estate in every major department store globally. "The Pink Ribbon Campaign," she said suddenly. "How many researchers does the foundation fund now?" "Over 50, with more grants planned. By 2004, they project it will be closer to 300. Estée nodded, satisfied. "Good. That will be part of our legacy too, not just the business." The limousine pulled up outside her apartment building, where the doorman rushed to open her door. As she prepared to exit, she patted Leonard's hand. "You know what I realized today?" she asked. "What's that, Mother?" "Beauty is eternal, but business models evolve. We've just evolved again." She smiled. "The public markets will push us, test us. But remember what I told Milstein, never separate the name from the values." With that, she stepped from the car into the golden afternoon light of a New York autumn, the city that had first shaped her ambition, now transformed by it. Behind her, the stock ticker would continue its climb, marking the beginning of a new chapter for the company that bore her name. A name that had become synonymous with both beauty and business acumen, with both glamour and substantive achievement. As she entered her building, a young woman passed by wearing a pink ribbon pinned to her coat. Estée nodded in quiet acknowledgement, reminded that some legacies transcend balance sheets and quarterly reports. Some, like the battle against cancer that had touched her family so personally, were measured in lives changed and research funded, a different kind of wealth altogether, but no less valuable for its intangibility. The winter light slanted through the tall windows of the Estée Lauder boardroom on Fifth Avenue, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table where the company's directors gathered for their quarterly meeting. Outside, New York hummed with the frenetic energy of late 1996, a city riding the first swells of what would become known as the dot-com bubble, where fortunes materialized from thin air and vanished just as quickly. Estée, now approaching her 90th year, sat quietly at the head of the table, a diminutive figure draped in a midnight blue suit, a triple strand of pearls at her throat catching the light as she moved. Her eyes, still sharp as cut crystal despite her advancing years, scanned the financial reports before her. The numbers are exceptional this quarter, Leonard Lauder, her eldest son and the company's CEO, explained to the board. Our post-IPO strategy is working exactly as planned. Estée nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. Just over a year had passed since the company she had built from her kitchen table had gone public. The transition from private family business to public corporation had been meticulously orchestrated, a masterclass in maintaining control while accessing the capital markets. The dual-class share structure had been her insistence, a fortress built to protect the legacy she had spent a lifetime creating. The Class A shares provide the public with economic interest, the CFO explained, gesturing toward a slide projection. While our family retains approximately 70% voting control through the Class B shares held in the Estée Lauder Family Trust. 10 votes per share, Estée murmured, more to herself than the room. The counter stays ours. Her fortune, once measured in product formulations and department store accounts, was now quantified in a more abstract arithmetic, her stake valued at approximately $2.5 billion since the IPO. The wealth felt different now, structural rather than personal, an architecture of power rather than simply money. After the meeting, Leonard walked with his mother to her waiting car. "We're looking at more acquisitions," he said, matching his pace to her deliberate steps. "Aveda is next. We can finalize by early 97. The hair care category complements our portfolio perfectly." "The founder," Estée asked, "will he stay?" Horst Reschelbacher. "Yes, initially. He built something special, natural products, environmental awareness, but it's the distribution we want." Estée nodded. "And the price?" "Around 300 million. She didn't flinch at the number. Scale had its own logic now. Her company had grown from bottles mixed by hand to a global enterprise with thousands of employees, but the fundamentals remained unchanged. Quality product, perfect placement, controlled distribution. "Just remember," she said as her driver opened the car door, "when you buy a brand, you're buying a promise. Don't break it." In the spring of 1997, Estée sat in her penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, watching the trees bloom into a soft haze of green. The television murmured in the background, CNBC, where commentators breathlessly tracked the stock market's seemingly unstoppable ascent. "The Nasdaq just passed 1,400, her assistant noted, setting down a tea service. "And our stock?" Estée asked. "Up another 3% today. The Aveda acquisition announcement was well received." Estée sipped her tea, remembering a time when success was measured in single jars of cream sold, not billions in market capitalization. The company now comprised a constellation of brands, the original Estée line, Clinique with its clinical approach, Aramis for men, Origins with its natural positioning, and the newer acquisitions, MAC, Bobbi Brown, and now Aveda. Later that afternoon, her grandson William arrived, files tucked under his arm. The third generation was now active in the business, ensuring the family's vision continued. "Grandmother," he said, kissing her cheek, "I've brought the portfolio reports." They reviewed the performance metrics for each brand together. Most showed robust growth, benefiting from the company's global distribution network and marketing muscle. But one line item made Estée frown. "Prescriptives is still underperforming," William acknowledged, following her gaze. "The custom blending technology, it's innovative, but the economics are challenging. Labor-intensive, high training costs, complex inventory management." Estée touched the page lightly with one perfectly manicured finger. "I remember when we launched it in '79. We thought technology would change everything." She shook her head. "But we were wrong about something fundamental." "As what's that?" "Technology can't replace touch," she said. "Beauty isn't algorithms, it's connection. The counter experience, that moment between the beauty advisor and the customer, that's where the magic happens." William nodded, taking notes. He knew that despite the company's size and sophistication, his grandmother still believed in the power of the personal demonstration, the transformative moment when a woman saw herself anew in the mirror. The summer of 1998 brought both triumph and tension. In her Park Avenue office, Estée reviewed the year-end numbers with satisfaction: revenue of $3.6 billion, net income of $360 million. A clean 10% margin that reflected both growth and discipline. But not all news was cause for celebration. Leonard arrived one afternoon, his expression grave. "Mother, we have a situation." He closed the door behind him. "An age discrimination lawsuit. A former saleswoman, 62 years old, claims she was let go because of her age." Estée's expression hardened. "Who?" "Margaret Helms. 20 years at the Macy's counter in Chicago." "I remember her," Estée said, surprising her son. Even now, she maintained a mental catalog of her beauty advisors, especially the long-serving ones. What does she claim? That she was replaced with younger staff as part of an unwritten policy to project youth at the counters. The irony wasn't lost on Estée, a company that marketed products promising ageless beauty while allegedly discarding older employees. The contradiction cut to the heart of an industry-wide tension. What do the lawyers say? They recommend settlement, $750,000, no admission of wrongdoing. Estée stared out the window, watching clouds drift over the Manhattan skyline. At 90, she had outlasted most of her contemporaries, becoming both a pioneer and an anomaly, a woman whose age conferred authority rather than invisibility. But she understood the cultural cross-currents buffeting her industry. "Pay it," she said finally. "But I want a review of our hiring practices. We sell to women of all ages. Our counters should reflect that." Leonard nodded, relieved. His mother's instincts, even now, remained sound, a blend of pragmatism and principle. As 1999 dawned, Estée's physical strength was waning, though her mind remained precise. She now used a wheelchair for most outings, conserving her energy for what mattered most. The company continued its expansion strategy, acquiring Jo Malone, the British niche fragrance house, for approximately $30 million, adding another jewel to its growing portfolio. One crisp October morning, Estée surprised her staff by requesting a visit to the Bloomingdale's flagship store on 59th Street and Lexington Avenue. Her driver wheeled her through the main floor, past the perfume atomizers that filled the air with competing scents, to the Estée counter where she had once personally applied cream to customers' faces. The counter manager recognized her immediately, eyes widening in surprise and nervousness. "Mrs. Lauder, what an honor. We weren't expecting." "Just observing today," Estée said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. For nearly an hour, she watched the beauty advisors interact with customers. Most were excellent, maintaining the standards of demonstration and service she had established decades earlier. But one young woman caught her attention for the wrong reasons. The advisor was attempting to sell a customer the latest skincare regimen, but her technique was sloppy. She applied product incorrectly, talked more than she listened, and worst of all, she failed to offer a sample when the customer hesitated to purchase. Estée gestured to the counter manager, who leaned down to hear her. "That one," Estée said, nodding toward the advisor. "She needs to go." "Mrs. Lauder, she's new, perhaps with more training." "No." Estée's voice was soft but final. "The fundamentals are non-negotiable. If she doesn't understand them by now, she never will." Later, as her driver helped her back into the car, Leonard, who had accompanied her, asked gently, "Was that necessary, Mother? We have training programs, performance reviews." Estée looked at her son, her gaze unwavering. "The counter is still our temple, Leonard. I won't apologize for maintaining standards. Not at 91, not ever." December 1999 brought a double milestone, the end of a century and what Estée privately acknowledged might be her last company holiday party. The event was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where executives and beauty advisors mingled beneath soaring ceilings and priceless art. In a quiet moment, Estée found herself beside a window overlooking Fifth Avenue, where Christmas lights twinkled in the early darkness. "Quite a year, grandmother. Record sales, new acquisitions, stock price at an all-time high." She nodded, watching the snow begin to fall outside. "And next year?" The analyst's project continued growth, though there's talk of the tech bubble eventually bursting. He hesitated. "Some are suggesting we should diversify more of the family holdings. Move some assets out of company stock." Estée smiled faintly. "The stock is the company, and the company is us, always has been. The concentration of wealth in a single asset, it's considered risky these days." "Risk is relative, William. I started with nothing but jars of cream and the belief women would buy them. Everything since has been gravy." She turned to look at the party, where 3 generations of Lauders mingled with the global executives who now ran the day-to-day operations. Besides, wealth isn't just what you have. It's what you build that lasts. As midnight approached, Leonard clinked his glass for attention and raised a toast. To Estée, both the woman and the company she built. May the new millennium bring continued success to the enterprise she created from her kitchen table. Applause rippled through the room. Estée, seated in her wheelchair, acknowledged it with a slight nod. Her expression was thoughtful, perhaps contemplating the journey from immigrant neighborhood to global business empire, from hand-mixed creams to a publicly traded corporation with billions in revenue. The fortune she had amassed, now estimated between $3 and $4 billion, existed primarily on paper in the form of stock held through complex trust structures. It was a different kind of wealth than she had imagined in her youth, abstract, institutional, dynastic. Yet as she watched the snow falling on Fifth Avenue, Estée knew that the true measure of her success wasn't the balance sheet or the stock price. It was the enduring quality of the products bearing her name, the women who felt more beautiful because of them, and the family that would carry her vision forward long after she was gone. The century was ending. Her company was not just surviving, but thriving. And though time was taking its toll on her body, the empire she had built stood strong, a testament to her unwavering belief that with the right combination of quality, service, and tenacity, a woman could create something truly beautiful that would outlast her own mortality. The champagne flutes had long been emptied, their crystalline forms catching the last glow of the millennium's final sunset. In a wheelchair positioned carefully at the center of the Breast Cancer Research Foundation Gala, Estée sat with regal posture despite her 92 years. Her once nimble hands now rested in her lap, the fingers that had touched countless faces and applied countless creams now adorned with the same perfect manicure she had insisted upon for 6 decades. Grandmother William Lauder bent to speak in her ear, his voice carrying over the gentle music. The photographer would like one more with the family. Estée nodded, her eyes, still sharp, still assessing, scanning the room of New York's elite. The flash popped as her children and grandchildren gathered around her wheelchair. Leonard, her firstborn and successor as CEO. Ronald, who had built the international operations. Evelyn, who had created the pink ribbon campaign that had saved so many lives. And the grandchildren, William and Aaron, the third generation, who would inherit not just her wealth but her philosophy. "Enough pictures," she said finally, her voice soft but commanding. "Let them enjoy themselves." Later that evening, as her driver navigated the streets of Manhattan back to her East 75th Street townhouse, she pressed a small notebook against her lap. Inside were notes in her meticulous handwriting: $10 billion revenue. Find a non-family CEO who gets it. Even now, as a new century dawned, she was planning decades ahead. "The company must outlive me," she whispered to herself, a mantra she had repeated since the day she had mixed her first creams in a converted kitchen in Queens. The New York skyline glittered through the car window, a testament to the American dream she had embodied. From immigrant daughter to billionaire, from kitchen chemist to queen of a global beauty empire. But she knew better than most that empires could fall without proper stewardship. "Home, Mrs. Lauder," her driver announced, pulling up to the elegant townhouse where she had lived for decades, refusing the Florida tax havens that many of her wealthy peers had chosen. New York was her home, the concrete foundation upon which she had built everything. Her nurse helped her inside, past the impressionist paintings that adorned the walls. Monet, Picasso, Modigliani, a collection worth more than $150 million. Art had been Joseph's passion first, her late husband who had believed in her vision when she had nothing but a jar of cream and an unshakable belief that women would pay for prestige. "I'll take my tea in the study," she instructed. Once settled among her books and papers, she reviewed the latest company figures. $5 billion in revenue. 24,000 employees. Products sold in 140 countries. numbers that would have seemed impossible to the young woman who had once carefully counted out change at her father's hardware store in Corona. The telephone rang. It was Leonard. "Mother, are you still working? It's nearly midnight." "The company doesn't sleep, so neither do I," she replied with the same determination that had driven her for nearly 7 decades in business. "The board meeting went well," Leonard continued. "The Avita integration is on track. The new millennium looks promising for us." "And the succession planning?" she asked, ever direct. A pause. "William is doing extremely well. The family's voting control remains secure at around 40%. "Not enough," she said simply. "The family must maintain control, but eventually we'll need someone from outside who understands what we've built, someone who gets it." "Mother, that's years away." "Plan for decades, Leonard, not quarters." After they hung up, she wheeled herself to the window overlooking the city. The dot-com bubble was showing signs of strain. She had seen enough economic cycles to recognize the patterns. A correction was coming. But Estée Lauder companies had weathered recessions before. Women would always need to feel beautiful, especially in dark times. The lipstick index, as economists were beginning to call it, cosmetics as affordable luxury during economic downturns. Her empire had been built on understanding this fundamental truth about human nature. The years passed with increasing quiet. Her public appearances grew rarer, then ceased entirely after 2000. The world changed dramatically around her. The dot-com bubble burst. The Twin Towers fell just miles from her home, and America entered new wars abroad. Through it all, she remained in her Manhattan sanctuary, receiving reports, making notes, offering wisdom to the family members who visited with increasing frequency as her health declined. On a spring morning in 2004, as New York shed its winter coat, her nurse found her awake unusually early. Staring at an old photograph on her bedside table, herself at Saks Fifth Avenue in 1948, standing proudly behind a counter that would become the foundation of an empire. "I'd like to make some calls today," she told the nurse, "and review some papers from the foundation." That afternoon, as sunshine streamed through the windows of her bedroom, Estée closed her eyes for the final time. She was 97 years old. The news of her death on April 24, 2004, traveled quickly through the beauty industry and beyond. Front-page obituaries proclaimed her an icon, a self-made billionaire, an immigrant success story. Her net worth was estimated at approximately $5.1 billion, a fortune built primarily on the company stock she had refused to sell, even after the 1995 IPO had made her one of the wealthiest women in America. The funeral was private, family only, no cameras, no press. Just as she would have wanted it. Later, a tribute was held at Temple Emanu, L for close friends and business associates, where Leonard spoke about his mother's unrelenting standards. "She taught us that prestige is not inherited," he said, his voice steady despite his grief. "It's built, touch by touch, counter by counter, relationship by relationship." The estate she left behind was a complex tapestry of wealth and legacy. Approximately $3.8 billion in company stock, about $200 million in real estate, including her beloved Manhattan townhouse and Palm Beach estate, and roughly $150 million in art. The charitable bequests totaled nearly $500 million, directed to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, and various Jewish charities. These donations not only cemented her philanthropic legacy, but also reduced the estate's tax exposure, estimated at approximately $2.3 billion under the federal estate tax rate of around 45%. Even in death, she had planned strategically. William Lauder assumed the CEO position later that year, continuing the family leadership that had defined the company since its inception. He faced a challenging landscape, increasing competition from Sephora and Ulta, the rise of online retail, and the approaching financial crisis of 2008. But the foundations his grandmother had built were strong. 5 years after her death, the board appointed Fabrizio Freda as CEO, the first non-family member to lead the company, fulfilling one of Estée's final strategic objectives. An Italian executive from Procter & Gamble, Freda understood global brand management and operational discipline while respecting the company's unique soul. Under his leadership, the company would reach Estée's target of $10 billion in revenue by 2008, just as she had projected. The family maintained significant voting power through their dual-class shares, preserving the control she had deemed essential while allowing professional management to drive growth. In the years following her death, Estée's influence on the beauty industry only deepened. The gift with purchase and sampling strategy she had pioneered became standard industry practice. Her insistence on counter-control training, exclusivity, and experience over wholesale volume remained the playbook for luxury beauty brands worldwide, even as new distribution channels emerged. Her multi-brand portfolio strategy, acquiring niche brands and scaling them, became the model followed by competitors like L'Oreal, LVMH, Shiseido, and Unilever. Even her approach to corporate governance, dual-class shares that preserved family control while accessing public capital influenced founder-led tech companies decades later. On a cool autumn day in 2010, Erin Lauder, Estée's granddaughter, and now a successful entrepreneur with her own brand, walked through the cosmetics floor at Saks Fifth Avenue. She paused at the Estée counter, watching as a sales associate demonstrated products to a young customer. "Would you like to try this?" the associate asked, offering a sample in the same way Estée herself had done thousands of times. Erin smiled, remembering her grandmother's words, "Never underestimate any woman's desire to feel beautiful." The legacy lived on not just in the products or the billions in family wealth, but in a philosophy that had transformed an industry. Estée hadn't just built a company, she had created an operating system for prestige consumption that continued to shape consumer behavior long after she was gone. In her final years, as she had watched the world change from her Manhattan window, she had known this would be her true immortality. Not the money, not the buildings, not even the family name on millions of products. It was the idea that beauty, however constructed, is a currency that never depreciates. That touch and intimacy could scale into billions. That family values and public markets could coexist. And that a jar of cream, offered with conviction by a woman who believed in its transformative power, could build an empire that outlasted its founder. The matriarch was gone, but her lessons remained. Never settle for good enough. Control your distribution. Understand that luxury is a feeling, not just a price point. Give before you ask. And perhaps most importantly, in business as in life, touch is everything. At Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where she was laid to rest in the family mausoleum, The inscription was characteristically understated for a woman who had built such an outsized legacy. Her name, her dates, and a simple phrase that captured her essence: wife, mother, founder. But for those who knew her story, the immigrant girl from Queens who had transformed herself into a global beauty icon, no further explanation was necessary.